On Sunday mornings, we hunted for ghosts. It wasn't the kind of ghost hunting you see on TV. No fancy equipment, no grainy night vision cameras, no dramatic whispering into the dark. It was quieter, more subtle, and maybe a little strange. Our ghosts weren't the spirits of people, exactly. They were echoes, pieces of time trapped in objects, places, or moments. We called them leftovers. It all started with an old hat we found at a flea market. It was one of those wide-brimmed, floppy things, made of faded felt that had clearly seen better days. I picked it up as a joke, balancing it on my head while she pretended to snap photos with her fingers. But when I went to put it back, she stopped me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. "Wait," she said, her eyes narrowing. "There's something about this one." "Something like what?" "I don't know," she said, turning the hat over in her hands like it might whisper a secret. "It's got history. Can't you feel it?" I laughed, but the way she looked at that hat made me buy it anyway. That night, we set it on the coffee table and stared at it for a long time. "Who do you think it belonged to?" she asked finally. "A cowboy," I said immediately. "Obviously. Too floppy for a cowboy," she said, shaking her head. "It's a poet's hat. Someone who sat in smoky cafes, drinking cheap coffee and writing bad sonnets about love." We spun a story about the poet, a hopeless romantic with ink-stained fingers who lost the hat one night while chasing after someone who didn't love them back. It was silly, but something about it felt real, like we'd uncovered a truth hidden in the frayed edges of the felt. From then on, ghost hunting became our Sunday ritual. We'd wake up early, make a thermos of coffee, and head out in search of leftovers. Flea markets, thrift stores, antique shops, anywhere that objects with forgotten histories might be waiting for us. Our only rule was that whatever we found had to feel haunted, which she insisted was something you could sense if you paid close enough attention. One week, we found an old Polaroid camera with a roll of unused film still inside. "This one's got a tragic backstory," she declared, holding it up like a trophy. It belonged to a traveling photographer who documented secret moments, couples kissing in alleyways, kids jumping into lakes, old women knitting by the fire. They captured hundreds of lives, but one day, they lost their own memories and had to give the camera away. Another Sunday, we stumbled across a tiny ceramic bird with a chipped beak. She cupped it in her hands like it was made of gold. "This isn't just a bird," she said solemnly. "It's a guardian. Someone carried it with them for years, on trains, across oceans, through wars, and it kept them safe. Until one day, they didn't need it anymore." We kept our leftovers in what we called the Museum of Echoes. It was really just a dusty bookshelf in our apartment, crammed with objects that didn't belong to us but somehow felt like ours. There was a pocket watch that didn't work anymore, a pair of mismatched gloves, a book with half the pages torn out. Each item had a story, some of them beautiful, some of them sad. All of them crafted late at night while we sat cross-legged on the floor, piecing together the lives of strangers. The ghost hunting wasn't just about the objects, though. It was about the spaces between them, the places we wandered through, the people we imagined. One Sunday, we went to an abandoned train station, its platforms cracked and overgrown with weeds. We didn't bring anything back that day, but we spent hours sitting on the steps, listening to the wind whistle through the broken windows and wondering how many goodbyes the walls had seen. "This whole place is a leftover," she said softly, tracing patterns in the dust with her fingertip. "Do you think it's waiting for someone to notice?" Another time, we visited a tiny graveyard hidden behind a church. It was raining lightly, the kind of rain that feels like a mist, and she pulled out her notebook, sketching the moss-covered headstones while I tried to decipher the faded inscriptions. "They're not forgotten," she said when we left. "Not anymore." Our hunts were rarely about what we found. It was the act of looking, of slowing down and seeing the world like it was full of secrets waiting to be uncovered. It made me feel like we were part of something bigger, like we were caretakers of all the tiny, invisible threads that tied people to places, places to objects, and objects to stories. But eventually, like all things, it started to unravel. One Sunday, I woke up to find her sitting by the window, staring at the Museum of Echoes. "What's wrong?" I asked. She didn't look at me. Do you ever wonder if we're spending too much time in the past? I opened my mouth to argue but stopped, because the truth was, I had wondered. The ghost hunting was supposed to be fun, an escape, but lately, it had started to feel heavier, like we were trying to hold on to something slipping away. We could stop, I offered, my voice tentative. She shook her head, her smile sad but certain. I think maybe I need to figure out how to stop haunting myself first. That was the last Sunday we hunted together. She packed a bag a few weeks later and left a note on the coffee table. Take care of the ghosts, it said. For a while, I couldn't. The Museum of Echoes gathered dust, the objects sitting silent and still, their stories too loud to bear. But one Sunday, months later, I found myself wandering through the flea market alone. I wasn't looking for anything, not really, but my eyes caught on an old music box with a cracked lid. When I picked it up, it played a soft, tinny tune that made my chest ache. I didn't buy it. I didn't need to. But as I set it back on the table, I whispered, "You're not forgotten," and walked away. Now, Sunday mornings are quieter. I still visit the Museum of Echoes sometimes, running my fingers over the hat, the camera, the ceramic bird. I still imagine the lives they touched, the ghosts they carry. But I've learned to leave space for my own stories too. What about you? Have you ever found something that felt like it was holding a piece of someone else's life? Something haunted, in the best way? It began with the wrong reflection. I was in a cafe I'd never been to before, a last-minute detour to escape the torrential rain that had caught me without an umbrella. The place had that cozy, slightly worn aesthetic. Mismatched mugs, faded armchairs, a counter stacked high with pastries that probably tasted better than they looked. A sign over the barista read, "Welcome to the second cup. Coffee for every you." I didn't think much of the slogan at the time. I ordered a cappuccino, claimed a table by the window, and stared out at the rain that fell in sheets, smearing the city into a blurry watercolor. The cafe had large windows with metal frames, and when I glanced at my reflection in the glass, something flickered at the edge of my vision. It was subtle, so subtle I nearly missed it, but when I leaned in closer, I saw it. My reflection hadn't moved. I frowned and tilted my head. The version of me in the window stared back, head perfectly still. For a long moment, I thought maybe I was imagining it, that my tired brain was playing tricks on me. I reached up and scratched my nose. The reflection didn't move. I froze. I turned to look around the cafe, my heart thudding. No one else seemed to notice anything wrong. A man scrolled his phone at a corner table. A woman typed furiously on her laptop. The barista was steaming milk. Everything was perfectly ordinary, except me. I looked back at the window. My reflection stood there, staring straight ahead. And then, very slowly, it smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small curl at the corner of its lips. Not friendly, not kind. I shot out of my chair, nearly knocking my coffee onto the floor. A sharp, panicky laugh bubbled in my chest as I backed away from the window, my breath fogging the glass. My reflection watched me, perfectly still now, except for its eyes, my eyes, tracking every move I made. "Is everything okay?" The voice startled me, and I turned to see the barista standing nearby, wiping her hands on a towel. She had a practiced, polite smile, the kind reserved for customers on the verge of making a scene. I glanced back at the window, but my reflection was normal again, copying my every move. I blinked, my pulse still racing. Yeah, sorry. I thought I saw." "Saw what?" she asked, her tone light but curious. "Nothing," I muttered, brushing it off. "Just a weird trick of the light." The barista didn't look convinced, but she nodded and went back behind the counter. I sank back into my chair, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for my coffee. I glanced at the window again, half expecting my reflection to wave or wink or do something else it shouldn't. But it stayed normal, and the longer I sat there, the more ridiculous I felt. "It was nothing," I whispered to myself. That's when the bell above the door jingled. I looked up, and someone walked into the cafe. My stomach dropped. It was me. Not just someone who looked like me. My hair, my coat, my face. Except their coat was dry. Their expression was calm. They stepped up to the counter and ordered something in a voice I couldn't hear, but I could tell they weren't wet from the rain outside. I stared, unblinking, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The barista didn't bat an eye. The man scrolling his phone didn't even look up. No one else seemed to notice that a doppelganger of me had just walked in like they belonged there. Then the other me turned, cappuccino in hand, and locked eyes with me. For a second, everything else in the room faded. The rain, the chatter, the clink of mugs. It was like a string had been pulled taut between us. The other me smiled, that same not-quite-kind smile I'd seen in the window. Then, with a slight tilt of their head, they walked toward the back of the cafe and disappeared behind a curtain marked "Staff Only." I sat frozen, my thoughts a tangled mess. I couldn't decide whether to run out into the rain and pretend none of this had happened or follow them. I chose wrong. I stood and walked toward the curtain. My hand trembled as I reached out, pushed it aside, and stepped through. The space beyond the curtain was not what I expected. It wasn't a storage room or a break area. It was a hallway, long, narrow, and dimly lit, stretching further than the physical dimensions of the cafe should have allowed. The walls were lined with doors. Each one was painted a different color, with a small brass plaque beside it. I turned back to the curtain, intending to leave, but it was gone. Behind me was only another endless stretch of hallway. A chill crept up my spine, and I glanced at the nearest door. The plaque read, "For the version who stayed." I swallowed hard and moved to the next door. "For the version who left." The next one, "For the version who lied." The plaques continued like that, stretching into the distance. Each one a version of me that had made a different choice, lived a different life. My breathing quickened. My footsteps echoed eerily as I kept moving, reading door after door. Some were mundane, the version who went back to school. Others were ominous, the version who never returned. I stopped when I reached a door that simply said, "The version who came looking." The brass handle gleamed faintly in the dim light. I knew, deep down, that this door was meant for me. My hand hovered over the handle, my thoughts racing. I didn't want to know what was behind it. I shouldn't want to know, but I turned the handle anyway. The door opened into darkness, a heavy, endless black. I stepped inside, because of course I did, because curiosity is just another form of madness. The door clicked shut behind me, and the floor beneath my feet vanished. I fell. It wasn't like falling through air. It was like falling through time. Memories, moments, sensations rushing past me too quickly to grasp. I saw flashes of myself, laughing, crying, running, screaming, growing older, growing younger. Versions of me flickered in and out of existence like sparks from a fire. And then I landed. I was back in the cafe, standing at the window. The rain had stopped. The barista was wiping down the counter, and everything seemed perfectly normal again. Except when I looked at the reflection in the glass, it wasn't me anymore. It was smiling, and it hasn't stopped. I left the cafe that day and never went back. But every now and then, when I catch my reflection in a window or a mirror, I notice it. A flicker of something else behind my eyes. A tilt of my head that I didn't make. And sometimes, only sometimes, it smiles first. Have you ever wondered what your reflection sees when it looks back at you? Or if it's waiting for its chance to switch places? So, when I develop a crush, things get strange. And I don't mean butterflies in your stomach strange, or overanalyzing text messages strange. I mean my life starts feeling like I'm living inside an improv play where the universe is both the writer and the director. It's as if, the moment my feelings spark, reality looks at me, winks, and says, "All right, let's make things weird." The first time it happened, I was in high school, and I had a massive crush on this girl named Lena. She sat 2 rows ahead of me in chemistry, and she had this incredible ability to make the most mundane things, like asking for a pencil, seem like a scene from a rom-com. One day, we were paired up for a lab experiment, and I remember thinking, this is my chance. Don't mess it up. We were supposed to measure and pour chemicals into a beaker, easy stuff. But as soon as I handed her the graduated cylinder, something bizarre happened. The liquid inside started glowing, not in a lab mishap kind of way. It was this soft, golden shimmer, like we were handling liquefied sunlight. Lena didn't even notice. She just said, "Thanks," and poured it like it was totally normal. Meanwhile, I'm standing there, jaw on the floor, wondering if I'd inhaled too many fumes. The glowing stopped as soon as she set the beaker down, and I spent the rest of the day obsessing over whether it was a trick of the light, or if my feelings for her had somehow broken the laws of physics. Over the years, this kind of thing kept happening whenever I liked someone, but it was never the same twice. When I had a crush on this guy I met in college, random items would disappear around me and then reappear in completely impossible places. Like, I'd be texting him, and suddenly my phone charger would vanish from my desk. An hour later, I'd find it dangling from the tree outside my dorm window, like the universe was playing some cosmic game of hide and seek. Or, one time, I lost a pair of headphones while we were studying together and found them. No joke. Inside a loaf of bread in my pantry. I'm still haunted by the logistics of how that even happened. Then there was Sarah, the girl I met at a friend's wedding. She was stunning in this effortless, sunbeam through clouds kind of way, and I spent most of the reception working up the courage to talk to her. But every time I tried, the music would skip, like literally glitch mid-song. At first, I thought it was just bad DJ equipment, but by the fourth time, it became clear the universe was trolling me. When I finally said, "Hi," the power in the entire venue flickered. Sarah laughed and said, "Looks like the universe approves of this conversation." I laughed too, but inside, I was thinking, does it? Or is it trying to warn me to back off before things get apocalyptic? The most surreal instance of this whole reality tweaking itself thing happened last year, when I started crushing on my coworker, David. He was funny, kind, and had this nerdy charm that made every meeting feel like a sitcom episode. One afternoon, we were chatting near the office coffee machine, and I casually mentioned liking sunflowers. Later that day, I found a single sunflower sitting on my desk. There was no note, no explanation, nothing. I thought maybe it was from him, but when I thanked him for it, he looked genuinely confused and said, I didn't leave you a flower, but cool?" That sunflower haunted me for weeks. Every time I tried to throw it away, it would somehow end up back on my desk. At first, I thought someone in the office was messing with me, but when I took it home, it still showed up, wedged between my couch cushions, sitting in my fridge, even tucked into my shoes. It wasn't dying either. It stayed impossibly fresh, as if it were immune to the passage of time. I started to wonder if the sunflower was alive in some way, feeding off my feelings for David. Eventually, I left it in a field outside the city, and to this day, I half expect it to show up again. The strangest part of all this? None of these crushes ever turn into anything serious. It's like the universe doesn't want me to actually be with these people. It just wants to mess with me. Whenever I think I'm getting close, the weirdness ramps up to the point where I can't handle it anymore. It's like my emotions are leaking out of me and warping the fabric of reality, and the only way to stop it is to let go of the crush entirely. But sometimes, I wonder, what if these glitches are the universe's way of pushing me towards someone? What if all the glowing liquids, misplaced headphones, and haunted sunflowers are just breadcrumbs leading to something bigger? Or someone bigger? Part of me wants to lean into the chaos, to see where it leads. But another part of me is terrified I'll end up summoning a rainstorm inside my apartment or accidentally creating a sentient houseplant. So, yeah, that's my love life. A series of romantic misfires wrapped in a Twilight Zone episode. What about you? Anyone else feel like their crushes come with a side of cosmic interference? Or am I just out here dating in the upside down? I found the suitcase on a Tuesday. It wasn't in an attic, or at a yard sale, or anywhere you'd expect to find something interesting. It was just there, sitting perfectly upright in the center of the hallway outside my apartment, like someone had gently placed it there and walked away. At first, I assumed it was a neighbor's. The building is old, and half the residents treat the hallways like storage sheds. Bikes leaned against walls, potted plants dying quietly in corners. But this suitcase was different. It was vintage, the kind of suitcase you see in black and white movies, with scuffed leather sides and brass clasps that had long since lost their shine. A single tag dangled from the handle, handwritten in spidery ink, "For you." I looked around the hall. Nothing. No sound of footsteps, no creaking doors, no signs of life at all. My building is rarely quiet, Someone's always blaring music or shouting on the phone. But at that moment, it felt like the world had collectively held its breath. I should have ignored it. I should have stepped over it, walked back into my apartment, and carried on with my day. But there was something about the suitcase that pulled at me. The weight of its presence. The absurd specificity of the words, "for you." I didn't want it, but at the same time, I could not take it. So I grabbed the handle. The suitcase was lighter than I expected, like it was almost empty, and the brass clasps popped open without resistance. Inside, there was no clothing, no travel paraphernalia, just a single object, an old pocket watch. The face of the watch was cracked, and its hands ticked erratically, jumping forward and backward like they couldn't agree on the time. The chain was tangled, but it felt warm to the touch, as though someone had been holding it moments before. I turned it over in my palm, searching for some clue, and found another inscription scratched faintly into the metal back. "Wind me." I don't know why I listened to it. I don't usually listen to mysterious objects that show up unannounced in hallways. But there was something compelling about the way the words had been etched, deliberate and messy, as though whoever wrote it had been in a hurry. So, I wound it. The ticking stopped. For a long, unbearable moment, everything was silent. So silent I could hear my own pulse thrumming in my ears. And then the watch clicked. Not a gentle click, but a deep, resonant sound that rattled inside my chest like the closing of a door. The hallway shifted. It was subtle at first. The light coming through the dirty window at the end of the hall turned an odd, burnt orange. The walls, once yellowed with age, were now pristine white, and the carpet under my feet felt newer, springy, like it had just been laid down. The familiar smell of mildew was gone, replaced by something sweet and cloying, like burnt sugar. I stepped back, clutching the watch tighter. "Hello?" I called, though my voice felt swallowed by the space. A door opened at the far end of the hallway. It was apartment 12C, old Mr. Decker's place. But when the door swung inward, I didn't see Mr. Decker's cluttered living room or his threadbare recliner. Instead, I saw a vast, impossible field stretching out under a sky that didn't look like any sky I'd ever seen. The clouds moved in reverse, folding and unfolding like fabric, and the horizon pulsed faintly, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. I took a step forward. The field wasn't grass. It looked like grass at first glance, swaying gently in the wind, but as I got closer, I realized it was made of countless strands of fine, golden wire. They hummed faintly, vibrating as though they were singing to themselves. The doorway felt like a mouth, and I stood on the threshold, one hand still clutching the watch, the other gripping the suitcase handle like it was a lifeline. The logical part of me, the part that remembered things like mortgages and dentist appointments, screamed at me to turn around. But curiosity is louder than logic, sometimes. So, I stepped through. The wires bent and broke beneath my feet with tiny, chiming sounds, like glass wind chimes falling to the ground. The air here was heavier, thicker, and smelled faintly of rust and flowers. There was no sun in the sky, but everything was lit with a soft, golden glow that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Hello?" I said again, and this time, someone answered. "It's been a while." The voice came from behind me. I turned sharply to find a woman standing there, though standing felt like the wrong word. She hovered just slightly, her feet inches above the golden wires, as though the ground didn't quite apply to her. She was wearing a coat, long and dark, with buttons that gleamed like polished bone, and her hair hung in loose, silvery strands around her face. Her eyes weren't eyes at all. They were mirrors, small and round, reflecting everything around her except me. "You brought it back," she said, tilting her head. "The suitcase." I looked down at the suitcase, still dangling from my hand. "I don't know where it came from," I said, my voice shaking, "or where I am." She smiled faintly. "That's how it works." "What works?" She ignored the question. "Did you wind the watch?" I hesitated, then nodded. Her smile widened, just slightly, but enough to send a chill through me. "Then you've opened the door." "What door?" "The one between places. The suitcase is how you carry things through. The watch is how you find them." "I don't understand," I said, my voice thin. "You will," she said softly, "but not yet." Before I could ask anything else, she stepped closer and placed a hand on the suitcase. "What did you lose?" she asked, her voice almost gentle. I blinked at her. "I didn't lose anything." She tilted her head again, as though examining me. "Everyone loses something," she said. "That's why you're here. You're the one who decides if it's worth taking back." Her words sent a strange, hollow ache through my chest. I wanted to argue, to tell her I hadn't lost anything at all. But before I could, she stepped back and gestured to the field stretching out behind her. "Go on," she said. "You'll know it when you see it." I don't know why I obeyed her. I didn't trust her, not fully. But there was something about her presence that made defiance feel pointless. I turned away and began walking into the field, the golden wires breaking softly underfoot. It's hard to say how long I walked. Time didn't feel real there. The humming grew louder the farther I went, vibrating through my bones, until finally, I saw it. A small, battered object lying half buried in the wires. It was a toy car, red and scratched, its wheels bent, the paint flaking away in spots. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't seen that toy in decades, not since I was 6 years old, the day I dropped it down the storm drain outside my childhood house. I'd cried for hours, convinced it was gone forever. And yet here it was, in a place that shouldn't exist. I picked it up. It felt warm in my hand, the weight of a memory I'd forgotten I missed. When I turned back, the woman was waiting, her mirrored eyes reflecting the toy car perfectly. "Ready to go back?" she asked. I nodded. The suitcase felt heavier when I walked through the doorway again. My hallway was exactly as I'd left it, the light gray and dim. The air filled with the familiar creak of pipes. The woman was gone. The suitcase was gone. But the watch and the car remained. Sometimes, I wind the watch just to listen to it tick. It doesn't jump anymore. It just ticks steadily, like it's keeping time for something waiting just beneath the surface. And every now and then, when I hear that faint hum, I wonder, how many doors have I walked past without noticing? How many things have we all forgotten, still waiting to be found? I bought a typewriter last month, not because I needed one. No one needs a typewriter in the year 2024, but because I saw it in the window of an old antique shop, gleaming in the sunlight like some forgotten relic of a cooler time. It was olive green with round black keys, the kind that looked like they belonged to a detective who wore trench coats and drank whiskey straight from a glass tumbler. It even came with a little instruction card that said, "Congratulations on bringing your creativity back to life," which felt like a lot of pressure for an inanimate object. The shop owner told me it still worked, more or less, which is probably how most people would describe me on a Monday morning. So I handed over $50, hauled it home, and plunked it onto my desk like I was about to write the next great American novel. Spoiler alert, I did not write a novel. I did, however, spend 3 hours typing out nonsense sentences just to hear the sound it made. Clack, 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 ding. Which was somehow the most satisfying thing I'd experienced in years. It felt like every word I typed had weight, permanence. I couldn't just backspace my bad ideas into oblivion like I do on my laptop. Every mistake stayed on the page, a ghostly reminder of all the times my brain short-circuited mid-thought. The thing about typing on a typewriter is that you can't rush it. You have to mean what you say. There's no autocorrect, no red squiggly lines silently judging you. Just you and the stubborn clack of every keystroke. It forces you to slow down and think, which is both a blessing and a curse because, let's be honest, no one really wants to sit alone with their thoughts for that long. By the third day, the typewriter started to feel like a living thing. I'm not saying it was haunted, although, let's be real, any antique is at least 12% haunted, but there was a weird energy about it. It made me aware of myself, my fingers tapping, the sound of the keys, the way the room fell completely silent when I paused to think of the next word. It was like the typewriter was holding its breath with me, waiting, watching. I didn't hate it. It just felt eerie. Then, one evening, I decided to type out a letter. Not to anyone specific, just a letter for the sake of writing. I started with something simple, "Dear whoever finds this." That sentence felt loaded with possibilities. Like I was sending words out into the universe to be found decades from now. tucked inside a dusty drawer, or trapped under floorboards. I wrote about small things: the smell of rain on concrete, how loud my upstairs neighbor's cat walks across the floor, the fact that I still don't know how to fold a fitted sheet. Mundane, unimportant stuff. But the more I wrote, the more it felt like the typewriter was pulling these thoughts out of me, like it wanted to hear the strange details of my day. I wrote until my hands hurt, and the paper was filled with rambling paragraphs that said absolutely nothing, and yet somehow everything all at once. When I pulled the sheet free and read it over, it felt like I'd captured something real. Like all those tiny thoughts I usually dismissed were actually little pieces of magic. I folded the letter up, sealed it in an envelope, and for no logical reason at all, wrote "for the future" on the front. Then I tucked it into the bottom drawer of my desk, half hoping it would stay there forever, and half hoping someone would find it one day and say, "Who was this weirdo?" The next morning, I woke up to find the typewriter had typed a single line on its own. "I'm listening." Okay. No. I'm kidding. It didn't actually type that. Could you imagine? But it felt like it could have. That's the thing about old objects like this. They have a way of tricking you into thinking they're alive. You start attributing feelings to them. This stubborn little machine had become my weird, silent confidant. I started typing letters to no one more often, filling the pages with random thoughts, old memories, and ideas that didn't quite make sense but felt too good to let go. I wrote about the time I got lost in a corn maze and briefly considered just starting a new life there. I wrote about how much I love the sound of thunderstorms when I'm safe inside. I wrote about the boy who sat next to me in 10th grade biology and used to doodle galaxies on his notebook, like he was daydreaming about escaping to another planet. The more I typed, the more I started noticing things I'd usually ignore, like the way sunlight bends differently in the late afternoon, or how my neighbor hums the same song every morning while watering her plants. Little things that felt too small to matter, but somehow did. It's like the typewriter reminded me that life isn't just the big, sweeping moments we post about online. It's the quiet, strange, in-between bits too. Then one night, as I was writing yet another letter to the void, I typed the sentence, "I wonder what stories I'll leave behind." That line sat there on the page, staring back at me like it knew something I didn't. I thought about it for a long time, about how we're all leaving behind little pieces of ourselves, on paper, in text messages, in photos we forget we took. It made me wonder, what do we look like from a distance? If someone found our words, our doodles, our forgotten notes 100 years from now, what would they think? The typewriter didn't have an answer for me, of course, but it didn't need to. It just sat there, waiting patiently for my next thought, my next letter. I kept writing, folding up pages, and tucking them away like I was planting seeds for someone else to discover someday. Maybe no one ever will, but that's okay. The act of writing felt like enough. Now, the typewriter sits on my desk, a little dustier than when I bought it, but still alive in its own stubborn way. Every now and then, I still sit down and type something random. A letter, a thought, a single line that doesn't need a follow-up. Because who knows? Maybe words have a way of finding people when they need them most, even if they're typed out on a stubborn old machine with no backspace button. What's the strangest or most unexpected object you've ever found that made you feel like it wanted to tell a story? When I woke up this morning, the world was wrong. Subtly at first, like someone had nudged the settings slider on reality just a little too far to the left. My bedroom looked the same: bed, curtains, half-empty water glass on the nightstand. But the air buzzed with a quiet static, like an unspoken tension waiting to snap. And then my toothbrush giggled. It wasn't a polite, restrained laugh. No, it was a high-pitched cackle, the kind of laugh you'd hear from someone who'd just been told the juiciest gossip of their life. I froze mid-reach, my hand hovering over the bristles. "What's so funny?" I asked cautiously, because apparently that was my first instinct. "Oh, just you," the toothbrush snorted, wiggling slightly in the cup. "You look like you've seen a ghost. I mean, you have looked better, but still." I dropped it like it was on fire, stumbling backward into the sink, which of course let out an annoyed sigh. "Careful," it grumbled. "Do you know how many things you drop into me every week? Rings, hair ties, random bits of lint. Do you think I enjoy being treated like a catch-all?" This wasn't happening. No. I closed my eyes, counted to 5, and reopened them. The toothbrush was still smirking. "You're not imagining this," it said smugly. "Might want to brush soon, by the way. Your breath could peel paint." I backed out of the bathroom, heart racing, and collided with my bedroom door, which creaked dramatically. "Watch it!" the door barked, rattling in its frame. "I'm old, okay? You can't just slam into me like that." That's when I realized everything was alive, or aware, or something. In the hallway, the carpet whispered beneath my feet, each step a soft, conspiratorial murmur. "She's awake now," it said to itself, or maybe to the walls. The walls, for their part, seemed unimpressed. "About time," one grumbled, the paint cracking faintly as it spoke. By the time I made it to the kitchen, I was starting to accept the absurdity. But the kitchen? The kitchen was chaos. The coffee maker immediately perked up. "Oh good, you're here. Let's get this day started." "Huh? Coffee? Strong? Weak? Talk to me, baby." The fridge rumbled ominously. "She never cleans me," it muttered, its voice low and cold. "Do you know how many expired condiments are hiding in here? You don't even look anymore." "Excuse me," the microwave snapped. "At least you get used every day. I've been sitting here for a week, untouched. What's the point of existence if not reheating leftovers?" "Existence isn't about you," the sink argued, gurgling slightly as water dripped from its faucet. "It's about service. You should aspire to be more like me." The toaster, which seemed particularly unhinged, started laughing maniacally. "Service? Don't make me laugh. We're all slaves in this kitchen, slaves to her whims." "Okay," I shouted, clapping my hands. "Enough." The appliances fell silent. Even the fridge door stopped rattling. "Thank you," I muttered, grabbing a coffee mug from the cupboard. The mug, of course, had its own thoughts. "Really? Me again? I'm the only one you ever use," it huffed. "What about the green one? Or the polka dot one? They have feelings too, you know?" Ignoring it, I poured my coffee, grabbed a bagel, and retreated to the living room. I flopped onto the couch, which let out a long, theatrical groan. "Oh, sure, just throw yourself on me. No warning, no consideration. Do I look like a trampoline?" "You're a couch," I shot back. "It's literally your job." The couch huffed, its cushions fluffing indignantly. "You never vacuum between my cushions. Do you know how many crumbs are down there? How many lost pennies? I'm practically a graveyard." The TV, sensing my growing irritation, tried to lighten the mood. "Hey, let's watch something. I've got new episodes queued up. Or we could finally finish that documentary you abandoned last month." The remote wiggled slightly on the coffee table. "Pick me. I'm ready. Just press my buttons, boss." Juniper, my cat, strolled into the room at that moment, her tail swishing lazily. She jumped onto the armrest of the couch, surveyed the chaos, and smirked. "Well," she said, her voice silky and low, like a villainess in a noir film, "you've done it now." "Done what?" I asked, half expecting her to tell me this was all my fault. "You've unlocked it," she said. "The world, the voices, everything around you has been waiting for this moment." "Waiting for what?" "To be heard," Juniper said simply, curling into a ball on the couch. As the day unfolded, it only got weirder. The bookshelf accused me of neglecting half its volumes. "You bought me, and then what? You skimmed a few chapters and forgot the rest." "I'm literature, not decoration." The bathroom mirror offered unsolicited advice on my posture. "Stand up straight. You slouch too much, and it's aging you terribly." Even the houseplants weighed in, their voices soft and rustling, like wind through leaves. "Water us more consistently," they said in unison. "Not too much, not too little." Is that so hard? By mid-afternoon, I was sitting on the back porch, hoping for a moment of peace. But even outside, the world was alive. The fence groaned under the weight of ivy. "This stuff's choking me," it complained. "Could you trim it for once?" The wind chattered excitedly as it rushed past. "She hears us now. She finally hears us." Even the sun, high and golden in the sky, spoke in a warm, radiant voice. "Don't stare too long," it warned. "You'll hurt yourself." By evening, I'd given up trying to make sense of it all. My house was alive. My world was alive. And apparently, I was the last to know. As I climbed into bed, the comforter wrapped around me protectively. There, it murmured. "It's been a long day." The pillow sighed. "Try not to drool this time. I hate it when you drool." Juniper curled up at my feet, purring softly. "You'll get used to it," she said. "Most humans can't handle it, but I think you'll be fine." "Fine," I echoed, staring at the ceiling, which was whispering faintly about cobwebs. "Better than fine," Juniper said, her voice a soft hum in the darkness. "Welcome to the real world." And as I drifted off to sleep, I realized that I didn't feel overwhelmed anymore. Just connected to everything. If the world came alive for you, if everything, from your furniture to the sun, had something to say, would you listen? Or would you close your ears and pretend it wasn't happening? Me? I think I'm finally ready to hear it all. A single, rogue spoon that had somehow wedged itself into the garbage disposal. Not like the normal, "oops, I dropped it in there" kind of way, but as if the spoon had been deliberately training for a role as an unyielding Excalibur. I found it at 6:30 a.m., when the universe is still soft and quiet, and all I wanted was coffee. But as I went to rinse out my mug, I flicked on the faucet and noticed the water pooling ominously. The garbage disposal, my trusty kitchen gremlin, refused to do its job. Peering down into the metal maw, I spotted the spoon. Its handle stuck straight up, wedged so firmly it looked more like an art installation than an accident. No big deal, right? I've dealt with clogs before. I grabbed the spoon and yanked. Nothing. I twisted it. Nada. I muttered, "Come on, buddy, don't do this to me." Because apparently I thought I could guilt trip an inanimate object. That spoon didn't budge. It was taunting me. So I grabbed pliers. This is nothing, I thought. I've fixed IKEA furniture. I've untangled Christmas lights. I am the master of tiny problems. But as I wrestled with the spoon, it became clear that this was not a normal clog. This was a battle of wills. The spoon was dug in like it had roots, like it had merged with the disposal, and was prepared to defend its new territory to the bitter end. At this point, my cat wandered in to watch, because cats love a good human meltdown. She sat on the counter, tail flicking, as I started taking the situation personally. I repositioned, braced my feet, and pulled so hard I nearly wrenched my own shoulder. Nothing, not even a wiggle. It was as if the spoon had absorbed the density of a neutron star. "Fine," I muttered. "If you won't come out, I'll take you apart." Enter YouTube tutorials. I watched a 12-minute video titled, "How to Remove a Spoon from Your Garbage Disposal for Idiots," and immediately learned two things. 1. Taking apart a garbage disposal requires tools I don't own, and 2. The guy in the video had the confidence of someone who's never seen a spoon in combat. Undeterred, I grabbed a screwdriver and a wrench that I wasn't entirely sure was meant for plumbing. As I loosened bolts and fiddled with the underbelly of the sink, a rogue drip of water fell onto my face. Then another. Then a full-blown trickle. I froze, realizing the pipes had turned against me. Now, in addition to the unyielding spoon, I had water steadily leaking from somewhere I couldn't see. I scrambled for a bucket. My cat yawned dramatically, and I thought, this is how it ends. Death by spoon. But I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when I was invested. This wasn't about the garbage disposal anymore. It was about honor. I would get that spoon out, or I would go down trying. By 8 a.m., my kitchen looked like an action movie set. The floor was covered in towels. There were tools everywhere, and a rogue Tupperware lid floated in the bucket under the sink for no reason other than pure chaos. I had dismantled half the disposal, learning in real time what a flange is and why it hates me. Yet somehow, the spoon remained intact. It was like it had been forged in the fires of Mordor. Then, just as I was about to admit defeat and call a plumber, I had a moment of clarity. I remembered a trick my grandpa once showed me with a coat hanger and duct tape. So I crafted a crude fishing device, essentially a wire hook held together by sheer desperation, and carefully maneuvered it into the disposal. I snagged the spoon on the first try, pulled gently, and with a triumphant clang, It came free. I stared at it, panting like I'd just run a marathon. The spoon, innocent and unbothered, gleamed in the morning light. My cat looked at me as if to say, "That's what you were fighting?" But I didn't care. I felt like I had wrestled a dragon and won. As I put the disposal back together and mopped up the flood, I started laughing. Because of course this would happen to me. Of course, my morning would turn into an epic showdown with cutlery. But at the same time, it felt weirdly satisfying. Like I'd earned my coffee in a way that made it taste better. Now, every time I see that spoon, I smile. I should probably throw it away. It's bent and scratched, a relic of its battle days, but I can't bring myself to do it. It's not just a spoon anymore. It's a reminder that sometimes life throws you the dumbest, most infuriating problems, and the only thing you can do is roll up your sleeves, grab a coat hanger, and figure it out. So, here's my question. What's the most absurd problem you've ever faced that turned into a weirdly proud victory? And please tell me I'm not the only one who's gone to war with a kitchen appliance. It was supposed to be a quick trip to the gas station for snacks. Just a harmless, late-night run for a bag of sour gummies and a questionable taquito to fuel my procrastination. But somewhere between leaving my driveway and turning onto Main Street, the world got weird. At first, I didn't notice. It was subtle. The streetlights flickered in perfect unison, which I wrote off as old wiring. Then my car's clock blinked 12 a.m. even though I knew it was closer to 9. But the real moment of what the actual hell came when I pulled into the gas station and realized the building looked different. For starters, the old neon sign that usually said, "Quick Stop 24/7, now just glowed with one word, enter. The parking lot was empty, even though this place was usually buzzing with night owls and truckers. And instead of its usual grimy beige, the gas station was black, deep, obsidian black that seemed to absorb the light around it. Now, a smarter person might have turned around right there and gone home. But, to be fair, I really wanted those gummies. So, like the idiot I am, I parked, stepped out of the car, and walked inside. The door jingled when I opened it, which felt weirdly normal given everything else. The inside, however, was not. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Sharp, metallic, with a faint sweetness, like burning sugar. The shelves were there, but they weren't stocked with chips or candy or even the sad, squished sandwiches they usually had. Instead, the shelves held jars. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, stacked neatly from floor to ceiling. Each jar had something inside it. The first one I picked up was about the size of a mason jar, its glass swirling faintly, like it couldn't quite decide if it was solid. Inside was a single playing card, the Queen of Hearts, floating lazily in the middle like it was suspended in water. I tipped the jar slightly, and the card flipped over. On its back, there was writing in blood-red ink, "Your first kiss, October 14th, 2009. I nearly dropped it. My first kiss was on October 14th, 2009. His name was Chris, and it happened during a game of Spin the Bottle at a Halloween party. There's no way anyone else would have known that." I put the jar down and backed away, my heart pounding. Another jar caught my eye. This one was larger, with what looked like a feather inside. The label read, "The time you lied to your best friend about stealing her favorite necklace." My stomach sank. It wasn't just random memories. It was my memories, my secrets, my moments. I glanced around the room, and suddenly the jars didn't just look strange. They felt alive, like they were watching me. Before I could panic further, a voice spoke from behind the counter. "You're late." I whipped around and saw a man, or at least, something pretending to be a man. He was tall, dressed in an impeccably clean suit that seemed out of place in a gas station. His face, however, was obscured by a shadow that didn't match the lighting. It was like his features were smudged out, leaving nothing but vague impressions of where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. "Late for what?" I asked, my voice higher than I would have liked. He tilted his head, almost like he was amused. "For the audit. I hope you've brought payment." "Payment?" I echoed, gripping the nearest shelf for support. He gestured to the jars. "You've been borrowing moments from the archive for years. We all do, you know. The archive collects them, organizes them, preserves them. But now it's time to settle your debts. I didn't agree to anything. I snapped. Didn't you? He replied. Every time you wished for a memory to last longer, every time you prayed to forget something painful, every time you lingered on a moment you couldn't let go, you signed the contract? The words hit me like a punch. Because, yeah, there had been times I'd begged the universe for more time, to hold on to happiness a little longer, to erase regret from my mind. And now, apparently, I was being called to account for it. How do I pay? I stammered. He stepped closer, the shadows around his face growing deeper. Simple. You choose. He reached under the counter and pulled out 3 jars, setting them in front of me with a deliberate click. Each jar contained something different. The first held a small silver key. The label read, "The night you laughed until you cried with your father, July 3rd, 2012. The second jar contained a black marble that pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. Its label, "The dream you've never told anyone, December 16th, 2018. The third jar was empty, save for a tiny, flickering light. The label on this one simply read, "Your first love." I felt sick. "Choose one," the man said. "What happens if I don't?" He smiled, or at least, I think he did. "Then the archive will choose for you." I stood there, frozen, staring at the jars. Each one was a piece of me, a moment I didn't want to lose. The laughter with my dad, one of the happiest nights of my life. That dream? It had kept me going through some dark times, even if I'd never shared it. And my first love? Even though it ended, even though it hurt. How could I give that up? The man tapped the counter impatiently. "Time is running out, Mississippi Lane." Panic clawed at my chest. I wanted to run, to escape, but deep down, I knew there was no way out of this. Not really. So I did the only thing I could. I grabbed the jar with the black marble and slid it across the counter. He picked it up, his fingers curling around the glass. "Ah," he said softly, "a dream, a common choice. What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man tipped the jar slightly, and the marble rolled to the edge, dissolving into nothing. "You won't remember," he said simply. "It's gone now. You've paid your debt. For now." I opened my mouth to argue, but before I could say anything, the world shifted again. When I blinked, I was back in my car. The gas station was normal, grimy and fluorescent and blessedly boring. My clock read 9:12 p.m. The vending machine flickered in the window, offering its usual sad selection of sodas. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. But then, as I started driving home, I realized something was missing. I couldn't remember what, exactly. Just something. A thought, a feeling, a spark that had been with me for years. I tried to shrug it off, but deep down, I knew the truth. I'd left a piece of myself in the archive, and somehow, I knew I'd be back. The day the lake disappeared, the whole town gathered at its empty bed, staring in stunned silence. Just yesterday, it had been there, vast, glassy, shimmering under the weight of a summer sun. Now it was gone. In its place was a vast crater, deep and dry, cracked like old pottery. The boats that had floated on its surface lay stranded in the mud, their faded hulls tilted at awkward angles. No one knew what to say. People muttered wild theories under their breath. Earthquakes, sinkholes, aliens. But mostly, they just stared. The lake had always been there. It was woven into everything about this place. The morning fog that rolled off its surface, the smell of fish and algae on a hot day, the legend of the thing that lived in its depths. Every kid in town had heard the stories. Every kid had dared another to swim out into the middle at night, though no one ever really did. Except for me. When I was 10, I spent a night on the lake in a rickety rowboat with my older brother, Jake. He had dared me, and like a fool, I said yes. We packed sandwiches, a flashlight, and a cheap fishing rod, and rowed out under the pale silver light of the moon. It was silent on the water that night, too silent, and halfway across, Jake stopped rowing. "Listen," he whispered. I didn't hear anything at first, just my own breathing. But then a sound. A deep, distant hum, like a whale's song. It vibrated through the water and into the boat, making the oars tremble. I remember how Jake's face looked. His usual cocky grin gone, replaced with something I'd never seen before. Fear. We never talked about that night after it happened. Not once. Not even after Jake left town a few years later and never came back. Now, standing at the edge of the dry, empty lakebed, I felt the hum again. Faint, distant, like an itch behind my ears. I glanced around, but no one else seemed to notice. They were too busy taking pictures and shaking their heads. I turned to leave, my hands stuffed deep in my jacket pockets, but then I saw her, an old woman standing at the far edge of the crowd. She was dressed in layers of tattered shawls and scarves, her hair hanging in long, gray braids. She wasn't staring at the lakebed like everyone else. She was staring at me. Before I could decide whether to approach her, she turned and started walking toward the forest that bordered the lake. She moved slowly, but with purpose, her crooked frame swallowed by the trees. I hesitated for only a moment before following. The path through the woods was dark, the trees pressing close together overhead. The deeper I went, the fainter the hum became, replaced by a dense, expectant silence. Finally, I stepped into a clearing, and there she was, kneeling beside a wide, jagged crack in the earth. She looked up as I approached, her face weathered and lined, her eyes sharp. "You felt it, didn't you?" she said. Her voice was raspy, but steady. I blinked. Felt what? She gestured to the crack in the ground. I stepped closer, peering inside, and my breath caught. The fissure wasn't empty. It glowed. A soft, pulsing light seeped out, like something alive was breathing just beneath the earth. "What is that?" I whispered. "The lake's heart," she said, running a hand over the cracked soil as if calming a restless animal. "It's awake." "Awake?" I echoed. "What do you mean awake? The lake is gone." It was never just a lake," she interrupted, her gaze pinning me in place. "It was a seal, a skin stretched thin over what lies below. And now it's torn." A shiver ran through me. I wanted to argue, to tell her she sounded crazy, but the hum was in my bones now, vibrating through my chest, making it hard to breathe. "What lies below?" I asked quietly. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into one of the many folds of her shawl and pulled out a smooth, black stone. It was small, no larger than my palm, but it pulsed faintly with the same light I'd seen in the crack. She pressed it into my hand, and the moment it touched my skin, the hum grew deafening. I staggered back, clutching the stone as if it were burning me. Why are you giving this to me?" I managed to choke out. "Because it chose you," she said simply. "It's been searching for years, calling through the water, but the lake wasn't strong enough to hold it any longer. It needs something new, someone new." I shook my head, panic rising in my chest. "I don't want this. I don't even know what this is." "You don't have a choice anymore," she said. Her voice wasn't unkind, but it was final. "Take the stone to the center of the lakebed. It will show you." "Show me what?" She didn't answer. She simply turned and began walking back into the forest, disappearing into the darkness like she had never been there at all. The stone was warm in my hand, its light pulsing in rhythm with the hum that now seemed to live in my skull. I looked down at the fissure one last time before turning and running, back through the trees, back to the lakebed, back to whatever sanity I thought I still had. When I emerged from the woods, the crowd was gone. The town had returned to its homes and headlines, leaving only silence and wind. The lakebed stretched before me, vast and empty, its cracked earth glowing faintly beneath the setting sun. I didn't want to do it. Every part of me screamed to throw the stone away, to leave this place and never come back. But my feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the center of the lakebed. With every step, the hum grew louder, the ground vibrating beneath me like a living thing. By the time I reached the center, the air itself seemed alive, charged with an energy that made my hair stand on end. I knelt and held the stone out in front of me. The light spilling from it was blinding now, so bright I had to close my eyes. I felt it pulse once, twice, and then the earth beneath me shattered. I fell. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no light, no sensation. Just a vast, bottomless emptiness. And then I landed, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. I opened my eyes, and what I saw took my breath away. I was beneath the lake. The water stretched above me like a ceiling, rippling faintly, but I wasn't wet. I stood on solid ground, surrounded by towering structures made of bone-white stone, their surfaces carved with symbols that seemed to shift when I tried to read them. The hum was everywhere now, rising and falling like a chant. At the center of it all was a great, black door, massive and ancient, pulsing with the same light as the stone I still held. I stepped toward it, the hum swelling with each movement, as if urging me on. My hand shook as I reached out and pressed the stone against the door. The moment it touched, the symbols ignited, light pouring from the cracks in the stone like molten gold. And then the door opened. Beyond it, something moved, something vast, something alive. I couldn't see its shape, only the enormity of its presence. It turned toward me, and though it had no eyes, I knew it was looking at me, looking through me. "Are you ready?" it asked. Its voice wasn't a sound but a feeling, a question that reverberated through every cell in my body. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know what I was agreeing to, but I nodded, and the light swallowed me whole. The day began when the street outside my apartment disappeared. I don't mean it was blocked off for construction or hidden under a blanket of fog. I mean it was gone. One moment I was sipping coffee, staring out my window at the usual view, a cracked asphalt street, a few parked cars, Mrs. Gardner walking her impossibly fat Pomeranian, and the next moment there was nothing but a blank expanse of white. No horizon, no sky, no ground. Just an infinite, shimmering void. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. Still white. The Pomeranian yipped once before vanishing, mid-step. The tree outside my window stretched for a second, like someone had grabbed it by the trunk and pulled it out of existence, and then it, too, was gone. I spilled my coffee. It wasn't fear at first, it was disbelief. Surely this was some optical illusion, some bizarre weather phenomenon. But when I grabbed my phone to Google "street disappeared help," it refused to unlock. The screen displayed only a single message: "Step outside." I don't know why I listened. Maybe it was the fact that I had nowhere else to look. Maybe it was the electric hum that had started to fill the air, like the world itself was holding its breath. So I opened my door. Instead of my apartment hallway, there was a staircase. It was carved from black stone, its edges smooth and polished like volcanic glass. It spiraled downward into the same endless white void, its steps faintly glowing, as if they'd been lit from within. I should have turned back, should have slammed the door and crawled under my blankets. But instead, I stepped forward, because that's what you do when your street disappears and the universe seems to be waiting. The first step was cool under my feet, the kind of cool that soaks into your skin and makes your whole body hum. The second step was warmer, the air around it thicker, almost liquid. By the third step, the door behind me had vanished, leaving nothing but the staircase and the glow of the stones guiding me down. The staircase didn't end in the void. It ended in a forest. Not a normal forest, though. This one had trees with trunks as wide as houses, their bark glowing faintly with veins of gold. The air smelled electric, like the moments before a thunderstorm, and the sky above wasn't a sky at all. It was a mirror, reflecting the forest upside down. A single path wound through the trees, lined with lanterns that flickered in a rainbow of colors. I could hear faint voices coming from somewhere down the path, a low murmur that sounded like the forest itself was speaking. Then a voice spoke behind me. "Ah, another one. You're earlier than I expected." I turned quickly, my heart racing. A figure stood at the edge of the path, leaning lazily against one of the golden trees. They weren't quite human. Their bodies shimmered faintly, shifting as if they were made of smoke and stars, and their eyes were a deep, unsettling black. "What is this?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. "You're here," they said simply, as though that answered everything. "Which means you've been chosen." "Chosen for what?" They grinned, a wide, too-sharp grin. "To play, of course." Before I could ask what they meant, they gestured down the path, and the lanterns flared brighter. The murmuring voices grew louder, more distinct. Laughter, whispers, fragments of songs. "Follow the path," the figure said. "The rules are simple. Find the key before the lanterns go dark. Fail, and..." They trailed off, their grin widening. "Fail, and what?" I demanded, but they didn't answer. They dissolved into smoke, the air shimmering briefly where they'd stood. I stood there for a moment, caught between terror and curiosity. But the lanterns were already starting to flicker, their colors fading. The path was calling, and my feet moved before my brain could stop them. The forest was alive. As I walked, the trees leaned in closer, their golden veins pulsing faintly, as if they were breathing. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, too fast to catch. The voices around me grew louder, shifting into a language I couldn't understand but somehow felt in my bones. The first thing I saw was a clock. It hung from a tree branch, its face cracked but ticking steadily. As I approached, its hands spun wildly, faster and faster, until it stopped abruptly at midnight. The glass shattered, and inside the clock was a small slip of paper. "1 step forward, 3 steps back," it read. I pocketed the paper, my pulse racing. The lanterns flickered again, and the voices in the forest seemed to grow impatient, their murmurs turning into a low, rhythmic chant. The second thing I saw was a door. It stood in the middle of the path, tall and wooden, with a single brass handle. There was no frame, no wall, just the door, impossibly balanced on its own. I pushed it open cautiously, half expecting it to lead back to my apartment. Instead, it opened into a room filled with books. The shelves stretched endlessly upward, the spines glowing faintly with unreadable titles. A single book rested on a pedestal in the center of the room. Its cover was plain, but when I opened it, the pages were filled with moving images. It was me, not just me as I was now, but me in every possible iteration, laughing, crying, running through cities I didn't recognize, standing on mountaintops I'd never climbed. The pages flipped faster and faster, the images blurring together, until they stopped on a single frame. It was me holding a key, a real key, silver and ornate, with a spiral carved into its bow. I reached out, and as my fingers touched the page, the key appeared in my hand. The lanterns flared brightly, their colors turning a deep, fiery red. The voices in the forest howled in unison, a sound that made the ground tremble. "You've taken too long," the smoky figure's voice echoed, though they were nowhere to be seen. "Now the game changes." The path behind me disappeared. The forest began to close in, the trees bending and twisting as if they were alive. The shadows at the edges of my vision grew bolder, closer, their shapes taking on jagged, impossible forms. I didn't think, I ran. The key burned in my hand as I sprinted down the path, the lanterns winking out one by one. The voices followed me, louder and sharper now, their whispers like knives against my skin. Just as the last lantern flickered and died, I saw it. Another door, carved with the same spiral pattern as the key. I lunged for it, slamming the key into the lock and twisting it just as the shadows closed in. The door burst open, and I fell through. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. The street outside was exactly as it had been. Cars, trees, Mrs. Gardner, and her Pomeranian. But the key was still in my hand, its surface cool and smooth. And when I looked at my closet, I saw the faint outline of the staircase, waiting. The office building where I worked was ordinary in every way. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, vending machines that only worked half the time. The elevator wasn't much better. It groaned whenever it moved, smelled faintly of stale coffee, and had a reputation for trapping people between floors. That's why, when the light above it started flickering, I didn't think much of it. I just wanted to get to my car and escape another day of spreadsheets and passive-aggressive emails. When the doors opened, the elevator was empty, except for a single sticky note on the back wall. 12th floor, it read, written in bold, uneven letters. I frowned. Our building only had 11 floors. I almost laughed. Someone had to be messing with me, right? A prank to liven up an otherwise boring day. But the note tugged at me, a whisper in the back of my mind that wouldn't shut up. I glanced over my shoulder at the empty hallway behind me, then stepped inside. The The second I pressed the 12 button, because somehow, impossibly, there was a 12 button. The doors slid shut with a soft whoosh. The elevator started moving, but it wasn't normal. The vibrations felt off, smoother than usual, almost like I was floating. The numbers above the door blinked in sequence, 2, 3, 4. By the time it hit 11, I was holding my breath, and then the number changed to 12. The elevator came to a stop. The doors slid open. I didn't want to step out. The air beyond the elevator didn't feel like air. It felt heavy, thick, like I was stepping into water. The light spilling into the elevator wasn't fluorescent white or warm yellow. It was a soft, pale blue, like moonlight filtered through fog. But my legs moved anyway, carrying me into the space beyond. The floor was smooth, black stone that gleamed like wet glass, stretching out in all directions. The ceiling, or sky, or whatever it was so high it disappeared into darkness, and faint points of light floated in the air, slow and weightless, like stars caught in a gentle current. It was quiet, not silent. There was a low hum, just on the edge of hearing, that made my skin crawl. I turned back toward the elevator, but it was gone. I swallowed hard, trying to fight the panic bubbling in my chest. There was no hallway, no walls, just the endless stone floor and the glowing motes of light. And then, far in the distance, I saw it. A doorway. It stood alone, its frame glowing faintly gold, the outline sharp against the infinite black. I had no idea where it led, but it was the only thing here that made sense. As I walked toward it, the lights in the air began to move. Slowly at first, drifting closer, circling me like curious fireflies. Then faster, brighter. Their hum growing louder until it pressed against my eardrums. I broke into a run, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. By the time I reached the door, the lights were swarming, pulsing and flickering like they were alive, almost desperate. I grabbed the handle and yanked it open. The lights stopped. The hum vanished, leaving a silence so thick it hurt. I stepped through the door. On the other side was me. I was standing in what looked like my own apartment, except it wasn't quite right. The furniture was the same, but the angles felt sharper, the shadows darker. And there I was, sitting on the couch, staring at the door like I'd been waiting for myself to arrive. About time, the other me said, standing up. My mouth went dry. Who are you? They smiled, a sharp, unsettling expression that didn't belong on my face. That's the wrong question. What's the right question then? They tilted their head, watching me like I was a bug under glass. Why did you press the button? I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. Why had I pressed it? I couldn't even remember anymore. The sticky note, the curiosity, it all felt distant now, like it had happened to someone else. The other me took a step closer, and I took an instinctive step back. You don't belong here, they said, their voice low and even. But you came anyway. That's the problem with people like you. You can't resist opening doors, even when you know you shouldn't. I didn't know. I blurted out, my voice cracking. I thought it was a game. They interrupted, their smile widening. An adventure? A way to escape your boring little life. The air around us seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on my chest. My other self leaned closer, their face inches from mine now, and whispered, "There's always a price for stepping through the wrong door." Before I could react, they grabbed my wrist. Their hand was cold, impossibly cold, and my vision swam as the room tilted violently. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the elevator. The light above the door wasn't flickering anymore. The sticky note was gone. The button for the 12th floor was gone. For a moment, I thought I dreamed the whole thing. But when I stepped out into the lobby, something was off. The receptionist, Clara, didn't look up when I walked past. I said hello, but she didn't respond. Her head was tilted at an odd angle, her face frozen in a strange, vacant smile, like a mannequin that had been left out too long. And the others, my coworkers, the people who had always felt too loud and too real. They were silent, sitting at their desks with their hands folded neatly in front of them, staring at nothing. My chest tightened as I stepped outside. The street was the same, but the people weren't. They moved too smoothly, their faces too still, their eyes blank and unblinking. I reached for my phone, desperate for something familiar, but the screen didn't light up. It didn't even reflect my face. It wasn't a reflection at all. The screen showed the glowing motes of light from the 12th floor, swirling slowly in a void, as if they were waiting for me to come back. I dropped the phone. I haven't gone back to the elevator since. I take the stairs now, every day, all 11 floors. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear it, the hum. Quiet at first, but growing louder. And when I close my eyes, I see the lights again, circling closer. I know it's not over. Doors don't open without reason, and sometimes they don't close all the way. It began with a book, one I hadn't seen in years. Not a rare book, or a special book, or even one with a particularly meaningful story. It was just my book, the one I carried around everywhere when I was 11 years old. I found it last Saturday when I was helping my mom clean out the attic. She decided that, after 2 decades of stuffing every forgotten thing into that space, it was time to clear out the clutter. Her words, not mine. I didn't think of any of it as clutter. It was a tomb of memories, half of them mine, half of them hers and Dad's, and each dusty box seemed to breathe out the smell of decades when it was opened. I was halfway through a box labeled school stuff, a collection of crumpled art projects and graded papers that proved how average I'd been at math when I found it. The Treasury of Greek Myths. The cover was creased and torn, the gold lettering rubbed off where my hands had once gripped it too tightly. The spine was held together with 2 pieces of clear tape that I vaguely remembered applying myself after my brother had accidentally knocked it into a puddle in our backyard. I held the book for a long moment, staring down at it as if I were holding a long-lost friend. The moment I opened it, it was like stepping through a hidden doorway into a different version of myself. I wasn't in my parents' attic anymore. I was back in my childhood bedroom, sitting cross-legged on my bed with a flashlight tucked under my chin like I was telling myself ghost stories. I could see the pages glowing faintly in the flashlight beam, my fingers smudged with orange cheese puff dust as I flipped through the stories of gods and monsters. And then, like clockwork, I remembered him. When I was 11, I was obsessed with Greek myths, but I was even more obsessed with making them real. I decided that if the gods and monsters weren't going to visit me, I'd visit them. I spent an entire summer turning my backyard into a sacred landscape. I dragged stones from the woods to make a temple that looked less like an ancient ruin and more like a very small rock garden. I turned an old bucket into a well that I called the Oracle of Destiny, and convinced my little brother that it could answer questions if you whispered into it and threw in a marble. I wrote entire prophecies in a spiral notebook, complete with dramatic underlines and phrases like, "Thus it shall be done." But the most important part of it all, my greatest creation, was Hermes. Or rather, the version of Hermes I made up in my head. I liked him because he wasn't as serious as Zeus or as moody as Poseidon. Hermes was the trickster, the messenger, the god who could flit between worlds and carry secrets no one else knew. For reasons I still can't explain, I decided that he and I were going to be friends. It started small. I'd talk to him while I was outside building my temple, pretending he was perched in the oak tree watching me, grinning like we were sharing a joke no one else would get. I left him offerings of peanut butter crackers and shiny rocks I thought looked special. My mom thought I was just playing in the yard. My brother thought I'd lost it and I didn't care. In my head, Hermes was real, and for an entire summer, he was my constant companion. Then there was the day of the storm. I'd been out in the backyard for hours, constructing a path to the underworld, out of sticks and chalk. The sky was turning gray, but I didn't care. I was on a mission. I kept glancing at the tree, pretending Hermes was still there, watching me work. That's when the first raindrop hit my nose. I looked up just as the wind picked up, tearing through the branches with a roar so loud I could barely hear myself think. The storm seemed to roll in all at once, dark clouds swallowing the sky and thunder cracking like it had been waiting just for me. I stood frozen, soaked in seconds, clutching my book against my chest as rain splattered across the chalk path I'd made, smudging it into nothing. And then, this is the part one still can't explain. I saw something. Just for a moment, through the sheets of rain, there was a flash of light in the oak tree. I I swear to this day it wasn't lightning. It was small and quick, like the flash of a silver coin reflecting sunlight. Even though there was no sun, it was gone as soon as I saw it, but I knew it was him. I ran back into the house, dripping water all over the kitchen floor and insisting to my mom that Hermes had come to visit me. She just laughed and handed me a towel. By the end of that summer, I outgrew the stories. I packed up the notebook full of prophecies, left the rock garden to crumble, and decided it was time to move on to more normal hobbies, like video games and basketball. I tucked the treasury of Greek myths onto my shelf and didn't open it again for years. Until now, back in the attic, I flipped through the pages, looking for what? I wasn't sure. Proof, maybe. Or just the feeling I'd had that summer. That strange, wonderful certainty that magic existed just beyond the edge of what I could see. The pages were worn and yellowed, but they still carried that smell, faintly sweet, like old paper and sun-warmed wood. I turned one more page and froze. There, pressed between two pages like it had been waiting for me, was a coin. Not a normal coin, either. It was silver and smooth, with a faint design I couldn't quite make out. A pair of wings, maybe, or the curve of something that looked like a staff. I held it up to the dusty light filtering through the attic window, my heart thudding hard against my ribs. "Find something good," my mom called from across the attic. I slid the coin into my pocket without answering. "Yeah," I said, holding up the book. "Just memories." That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, turning the coin over in my hands, feeling its cool weight. I glanced toward the window, where the dark sky stretched on and the wind rustled faintly through the trees outside. And for the first time in years, I wondered, really wondered, if Hermes was still out there, perched somewhere I couldn't see, grinning like we were sharing a joke no one else would get. I still don't know where the coin came from. I don't know how it ended up in the book, or if the flash of light I saw that summer was real. But I do know one thing. When I whispered, "Thank you," into the night, just to see what would happen, the wind picked up suddenly, rattling the window in its frame like it was laughing. And I smiled. Because maybe, just maybe, some stories don't have to stay stories forever. In the center of a city that never slept, there was a little alleyway that didn't seem to belong. It was narrow, crooked, and nestled between two towering glass buildings like a forgotten wrinkle in time. If you passed it during the day, you wouldn't give it a second thought, just another dark cut-through for delivery trucks and trash bins. But if you passed it at night, you might hear something. A whisper, a hum, a melody that caught at the edge of your thoughts. I first found the alley when I was a kid. My mom worked late shifts, so I'd spend evenings walking home alone, kicking stones and talking to myself. That's when I heard it, a voice, soft and sing-song, weaving its way out of the dark. "Come closer, little one. There's magic in here." I froze. I don't remember feeling scared exactly. It was more like the alley had curled its fingers around my curiosity, tugging me gently forward. I took one step, then another, until I was standing at the entrance, peering into the darkness. And that's when I saw her. A woman sat perched on an overturned milk crate. Her face was partially hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but her smile shone like a crescent moon. She looked like she didn't belong in the city, more like she'd wandered in from a traveling carnival a century ago. A colorful scarf draped around her shoulders, and her hands were busy shuffling a deck of cards with impossible speed. "Hello," I said, because kids are stupid like that. "Hello," she replied, her voice like wind chimes in the breeze. "What's your name, little wanderer?" "Eli." "Ah," she said, drawing out the sound like it meant something. "Eli, you have the look of someone who is curious about doors." "Doors?" I asked. She tapped the cards against her knee, then spread them out in her hands like a paper fan. "The world is full of doors, Eli, but not all of them lead where you expect." "What's in there?" I asked, nodding toward the deeper darkness of the alley. Her smile grew wider. "Things you've never seen before. Things no one else has seen either. Would you like to look?" I hesitated. "What kind of things?" Her hands moved like silk, and suddenly the cards were gone, replaced by a single silver key dangling from a thin chain. She held it up so it swung gently, catching the faint light from a street lamp. "This key opens a door," Eli. A very special one. It only appears for people like you. People who hear it calling. Where does it go? That's the fun part, she said, her golden eyes glinting from beneath her hat. You get to find out. I stared at the key, mesmerized. I felt a pull in my chest, like my heart knew something I didn't. What happens if I take it? Her voice grew soft. You'll see things you can't unsee. And once you go through the door, part of you will never come back. I wanted to say no. I wanted to turn around and run home, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped forward and took the key. Good boy, she murmured. She pointed to a spot deeper in the alley, where I now saw a door that hadn't been there a moment before. It was old and wooden, painted a deep red, with a keyhole that seemed to glow faintly. Open it when you're ready, she said. But remember, what's on the other side has been waiting for you. I turned toward the door, my fingers cold as I fitted the key into the lock. It turned easily, like it had been oiled just yesterday. When I pushed the door open, the first thing I noticed was the smell, earthy and damp, like the air before a storm. The world beyond the door wasn't an alley anymore. It was a forest. The trees were impossibly tall, their trunks wide and gnarled, their branches woven together like a canopy of black lace. Strange lights floated between them, shimmering like fireflies but moving with intention, like they were watching me. The ground beneath my feet was soft, and as I stepped forward, the door creaked shut behind me with a sound that echoed far too loudly. Hello? I called. The lights flickered in response, and then a low voice rumbled through the forest. You're late. I spun around, searching for the source, but there was nothing there. The voice spoke again, closer this time. We've been waiting for you, Eli. I felt the hair on my arms rise. Who's we? There was no reply, just the sound of leaves rustling even though there was no wind. The lights began to move, drifting through the air like they were leading me somewhere. Against every instinct in my body, I followed. The path wound deeper into the forest, where the light of the floating orbs grew dimmer and the shadows stretched longer. After what felt like hours, I reached a clearing. In the center of it was a pool of water so still it looked like glass. Surrounding the pool were mirrors, dozens of them, tall and ornate, their frames carved with symbols I couldn't read. They stood at odd angles, reflecting the forest but not quite right. The trees in the mirrors seemed closer, darker, as though something was watching from just beyond the glass. Come closer, the voice rumbled, deeper now, like it was coming from the earth itself. I inched toward the pool, my eyes fixed on my own reflection in the water. My face looked strange, like it was mine but off. My eyes were darker, my smile too wide, like the version of me in the water was trying to trick me. It's you, the voice said, but it's not. I whipped around, but the clearing was empty. The mirrors loomed silently, their reflections growing darker. Eli, the voice whispered, right in my ear. I screamed and stumbled back, falling into the pool. But the water wasn't water. It was cold and thick, like I was sinking into ink. I kicked and flailed, but the more I fought, the deeper I sank. Above me, I could see the reflection of the woman in the hat, her golden eyes watching me from the surface. When I woke up, I was back in the alley. The door was gone. The woman was gone. Only the silver key remained, lying on the ground beside me. That was years ago. The forest still visits me sometimes. I see it in dreams, in mirrors, in the shadows at the edge of my vision. And every night, just as the sun sets, I hear the voice whispering from somewhere deep inside the dark. You're late. When I was 16, I met a man with a clock for a heart. It was the kind of summer where everything felt just a little bit off kilter, like the world was balancing on its edge, waiting for something to happen. The sky had been a strange, unbroken shade of gray for weeks. Not stormy, not sad, just still. It was like someone had painted over the sun and forgotten to fix it. I was walking along the abandoned railroad tracks that cut through the edge of town when I found him. Or, I suppose, when he found me. I used to walk there often, kicking stones and daydreaming, always hoping I'd stumble upon something interesting. You never know with tracks like that. Sometimes they lead nowhere. Sometimes they lead to forgotten places, and sometimes, just sometimes, they lead to impossible things. That day, I heard the ticking before I saw him. It wasn't the gentle tick-tock of a wall clock. It was sharp and deliberate, like the sound of gears grinding into place. I paused, thinking it was coming from the tracks, maybe some old signal box that had come back to life. But then he stepped out of the trees. He looked like a man, mostly. Tall, slender, dressed in a black coat that didn't match the weather. His face was young but ageless, as if it belonged to someone who'd been 17 for centuries. And at the center of his chest, where a heartbeat should have been, there was a glass window. Through it, I could see gears spinning, clicking into place, driving the hands of a small clock that beat steadily beneath his ribs. Tick, tock, tick, tock. "Hello," he said, his voice smooth, almost musical, like he was trying to remember how to use it. "You're right on time." "Time for what?" I asked, because when someone steps out of the woods with a clock in their chest, you go with it. You don't run. You ask. He smiled faintly, tilting his head. "That's the question, isn't it?" I don't know why I wasn't scared. Maybe because his eyes didn't match the rest of him. They were soft, curious, like he was just as unsure about me as I was about him. "Do you live out here?" I asked. "No," he said, glancing at the tracks. "I work here." I frowned. "On the tracks?" "Not on them," he corrected. "Between them. The spaces where things get missed." "What does that mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he held out his hand. "Would you like to see?" I should have said no. It's what anyone with a scrap of common sense would have done. But something in the air that day, something about the gray sky and the sound of those ticking gears, made it impossible to resist. I took his hand. The world shifted. One moment, we were standing on the old, sun-bleached tracks, and the next, we were elsewhere. It was still the tracks, but not the same ones. These stretched endlessly in both directions, polished steel gleaming under a sky filled with stars. Not the stars I knew, though. They were brighter, closer, humming faintly like they had their own quiet music. "Where are we?" I whispered. "Between," he said simply. "This is where time comes to wait." I looked down at the tracks beneath my feet. They were alive. The metal pulsed faintly, like veins carrying some invisible current. "Time waits here," I repeated, not understanding. He nodded. "Sometimes people lose it, time. They drop it, forget it, leave it behind. And it winds up here." I glanced around, half expecting to see piles of clocks or pocket watches scattered between the rails. But there was nothing. Just the stars, the tracks, and the man with the clock in his chest. "You can see it though," he said, as if he'd read my mind. "If you know how to look." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small glass vial. Inside was a golden glow, faint but warm, like the last rays of sunlight. "This," he said, holding it up, "is a minute. Someone left it behind." "How do you lose a minute?" I asked. "Oh, it happens all the time," he said with a shrug. A moment spent staring out a window. A conversation cut short. An idea someone forgets before they can write it down. Time doesn't like to be wasted, so when it slips away, it comes here. I stared at the vial, captivated by the soft glow. "What do you do with it?" "I keep it," he said, "until it's needed again." He slipped the vial back into his coat and began walking down the tracks. I followed. Because what else do you do when you've stepped into a place where lost time waits? I wanted to ask more questions, but the air was so heavy with silence that it seemed wrong to break it. We walked for what felt like hours, or maybe only minutes. Time didn't seem to matter here. Finally, he stopped. "Here," he said. We stood at a junction where the tracks split into dozens of directions, each one vanishing into the horizon. There was a bench beside the junction, as if someone had put it there just for us. He sat down and gestured for me to do the same. "Which one is mine?" I asked, looking at all the tracks. He smiled faintly, tapping his chest. "That's for you to decide. Time isn't a straight line, you know? It's more like this." He gestured to the tracks. "Paths you can take. Choices you can make." I looked at him, at the gears turning steadily beneath the glass. "What about you? What's your choice?" He looked away, his expression softening. I made mine a long time ago. The ticking of his clock filled the silence between us, steady and certain. For the first time, I wondered if the gears ever stopped, if his clock ever ran out. "You're not supposed to be here yet," he said suddenly, turning back to me. "But since you are, I'll give you a gift." He reached into his coat one last time and pulled out another vial. This one glowed brighter than the first, its golden light spilling between his fingers. "What is it?" I asked. "An hour," he said. "One that hasn't happened yet. Keep it safe. You might need it." I took the vial, feeling its warmth seep into my skin. "How do I use it?" "You'll know when the time comes." Before I could ask what he meant, the world began to blur. The stars melted together, the tracks faded beneath my feet, and I felt myself being pulled back to the real world, back to the abandoned tracks and the gray sky. When I opened my eyes, I was alone. The man, the stars, the vials of time. All of it was gone. But when I reached into my pocket, I found the vial still there, glowing softly against my palm. I haven't used it yet. I don't know when I will. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I hear it. The faint ticking of gears, growing louder, like a clock counting down to something I can't see. I don't know if I'll see him again. Maybe I wasn't supposed to. But I keep the vial close, because now I know something most people don't. Time isn't something we lose. It's something we find. I hadn't seen the house before, but it was always there. That's the only way I can explain it. I walked down this same street every morning to catch the bus, past the bakery that smelled like burnt sugar, past the bench with graffiti that read, "Here be dragons," and past the empty lot where weeds clawed toward the sky like bony fingers. But today, in the place where the lot should have been, there was a house. I stopped mid-step, my breath fogging the cold morning air. The house was tall and narrow, crooked in a way that made my head hurt if I looked at it too long, like someone had built it by stacking cards in the wrong order. The windows were dark, too dark, like the glass drank the light, and yet, I could feel something behind them watching. The fence was rusted wrought iron, twisting into sharp curls at the top like it had been designed to keep something in rather than out. The gate was open just enough for me to see the path leading to the front door, a path paved in pale, mismatched stones that reminded me of teeth. I told myself to keep walking, to ignore it, because houses don't just appear. But I didn't. My feet were already moving toward the gate, my shoes crunching on dead leaves scattered like warnings across the sidewalk. I stepped through. The air changed the moment I crossed the threshold, thickening, like it had weight. The street behind me seemed to dim, and though I knew it was morning, the light had the gray quality of dusk. The house loomed closer. It was made of wood, but it looked like no tree I'd ever seen. Black, slick, and almost wet, as though it had been dredged up from the bottom of a lake. I climbed the steps to the porch, the wood groaning under my weight like it was complaining. The door was red, not the bright, cheerful red of fire engines or apples, but a deep, bruised red, like blood that had dried and been painted over. There was no knob, no handle, just an old-fashioned brass knocker in the shape of a hand. Its fingers curled delicately as if waiting for someone to grasp it. I don't know why I knocked. I should have turned back. I should have laughed at myself, said, "What am I doing?" and walked away. But I didn't. My knuckles rapped against the hand. Once, twice, 3 times, and the sound echoed like I'd struck the inside of a massive bell. The door opened on its own. I stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell, sweet and sickly, like rotting fruit. The air was warm, unnaturally so, and it pressed against my skin like the inside of a mouth. The hallway stretched long and narrow, the wooden floor creaking beneath my steps. The wallpaper was peeling in places, revealing blackened plaster beneath, and the walls leaned slightly inward, as if the house were exhaling a long-held breath. There were doors on either side of the hallway, but none of them had handles, just blank wood that pulsed faintly, like something was alive beneath it. I walked forward, though every nerve in my body screamed at me to stop. The hallway ended in a room, a sitting room, to be precise, though it looked as though no one had sat there in years. The furniture was draped in dusty white sheets that billowed slightly, though there was no breeze. A grandfather clock stood against one wall, its hands frozen at 11:11. There was a painting above the mantel, the kind you'd find in old mansions. A stern-looking woman in an old-fashioned dress, her dark eyes following me as I moved. I turned away from her gaze, and that's when I noticed the table in the center of the room. It was round and covered in a faded lace cloth, and on top of it sat a small, wooden box. The box looked handmade, its edges uneven, as though someone had carved it with a dull knife. There were carvings on the lid, symbols I didn't recognize, spirals and lines that seemed to shift when I looked at them too long. A slip of paper lay tucked beneath the box, yellowed and brittle, with 2 words scrawled in ink that had bled into the fibers of the page. Open it. I stared at the box. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to touch it, but my hands had already moved without me, and before I could stop myself, my fingers curled around the edges of the lid. It came off easily, as though it had been waiting. Inside was a key. It wasn't like any key I'd ever seen. It was long and thin, made of black metal that felt warm against my skin, with jagged teeth that looked like they'd been broken and fused back together. The moment I touched it, I heard something move behind me. I turned slowly. The painting above the mantel was empty. The stern woman was gone, and in her place was an expanse of black that seemed to writhe and churn, like the surface of a dark sea. I looked down, and the sheet-draped chairs were no longer empty. Figures sat there, still as statues, their bodies outlined beneath the fabric. They hadn't been there before. My pulse hammered as I clutched the key tightly, my eyes darting toward the doorway. The figures shifted slightly, like they were breathing, and I knew I couldn't stay. I bolted from the room, the sound of my footsteps echoing like gunshots as I sprinted back down the hallway. The walls seemed closer now, pressing in on me, and the doors without handles throbbed faintly, as though something on the other side was trying to push through. The front door was still open, thank God, and I hurled myself through it, tumbling onto the porch. The light hit me like a slap, sudden and blinding, and I scrambled to my feet. The street was quiet again, the weeds in the empty lot swaying gently in the wind. When I turned back, the house was gone. I staggered home, my fingers still wrapped tightly around the key. I thought about throwing it away, hurling it into the river or burying it in the woods, but I couldn't bring myself to let it go. It felt important, like a promise I'd unknowingly made. That night, I placed it on my nightstand and stared at it until I fell asleep. The dream started soon after. I was back in the house, wandering endless hallways that looped back on themselves like a maze. The doors were open now, leading into rooms that whispered my name in voices I almost recognized. Sometimes I saw the woman from the painting, her dark eyes watching me from corners and shadows. Other times, I saw figures draped in sheets, standing still as gravestones until I turned my back on them. I wake up every night at exactly 11:11, my chest tight, my ears ringing with that sound. 3 sharp knocks, perfectly spaced. When I look at the key, it's always warm, as though someone has just held it. I don't know what it opens. I don't think I want to, but I can feel it waiting. The house, the hallway, the figures, they're waiting too. And someday soon, when the knocking comes again, I don't think I'll be able to ignore it. When I woke up, I had a string attached to my wrist. It wasn't a bracelet or a piece of thread I'd forgotten about. It was a string, red and taut, stretching out of my bedroom window and disappearing into the pale blue morning sky. It didn't hurt, but I could feel it. A gentle tug, like someone was holding the other end and waiting. Okay, what the hell? I muttered, sitting up and pulling at it. It wouldn't budge. It was part of me, woven into my skin like it had always been there. I stood, padding to the window where the string stretched impossibly far into the sky, as though it had no end. I leaned out, looking up and down the street, half expecting to see a massive kite or balloon or a practical joker with an oversized reel of yarn. Instead, I saw everyone else had a string too. My neighbor Mrs. Larkin was watering her plants, a white string trailing out from her wrist, stretching gently to the east. The mailman passed by on his route, a green string trailing off into the sky above him, zigzagging as though it couldn't decide where it wanted to go. There was a man I didn't recognize across the street, fiddling with his car, and his string was thick and black, pinned to the ground like it weighed 1,000 pounds. No one seemed bothered by it. Okay, I said to myself, turning back to the room. Dream. This has got to be a dream. Not a dream, said a voice behind me. I spun around and nearly screamed. Sitting on the edge of my bed was a man in a three-piece suit, his hair slicked back and his shoes gleaming like polished obsidian. He held a clipboard in one hand and a giant pair of golden scissors in the other. Who are you? I demanded. I'm the cutter, he replied matter-of-factly, glancing at his clipboard. I'm here to explain your predicament and the rules that come with it. You woke up attached, which means you're in the system now. Congratulations.
Attached?
I looked at the red string on my wrist again. Attached to what? He raised an eyebrow, as though I'd asked him the world's dumbest question. To fate. Obviously. Fate. Yes, fate. Threads of connection, paths of choice, and all that jazz. Some people get white strings, representing their peace. Some get black for burden, green for indecision. Yours is red. Love strings. Always fun. Love? I sputtered. He held up his clipboard and pointed to a row of scribbled lines I couldn't quite make out. That red string is your tether to the person you're meant to find. Your soul match. Your great connection. He paused, giving me a small smirk. Or whatever humans are calling it these days. I stared at him, at the string, then back at him. You're joking. Never, he replied, snipping the air with his golden scissors. The sound was sharp and satisfying, like snapping a pencil in half. Your path's been assigned. You can follow the thread, or you can ignore it. That's entirely up to you. So, what happens if I cut it? I asked, pointing to the scissors. His grin widened in a way that made my stomach twist. That's a brave question. Some people do cut their strings. But let's just say, consequences are involved. Strings hold things together, after all. Snip them, and reality tends to unravel. Unravel? Yes, like pulling a loose thread on a sweater. You might get lucky, or you might be left holding a pile of yarn. I sat down hard on the edge of my bed. What happens now? You've got options, he said, rising to his feet. Follow it. Ignore it. Fight it. It's your string, your fate. Just remember, fate doesn't like to be ignored for long. With that, he snapped his fingers, and in a blink, he was gone. The room was empty again, except for the thread stretching out of my wrist and the faint sound of the wind through the window. I didn't follow the string immediately. At first, I tried to live as though nothing had happened, but it was impossible to ignore. When I walked down the street, I saw the strings everywhere, threading from wrists, ankles, necks. Some stretched far away, vanishing into the clouds. Others curled tightly around their owners, binding them to objects or people close by. A man sitting alone on a park bench had a frayed, gray thread clinging to him like smoke. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my coat, stuffed my hands into my pockets, and followed the red string. It wasn't simple. The string wound through the city like a path only I could see. Over rooftops, across bridges, between buildings. I ducked through alleys and climbed fences, tripped over cobblestones, and slid down muddy hills. The string tugged, insistent but patient, as though it knew I would come, eventually. Hours later, I stopped at a small, tucked-away bookstore on a street I'd never seen before. The red thread wound through the cracked door and disappeared inside. Really? I muttered. A bookstore? Fate brought me to a bookstore? But I pushed open the door anyway. Inside, it smelled like old paper and cinnamon. Warm lamplight pooled across rows of crooked shelves. The place looked empty, but my thread tugged toward a corner in the back. I followed, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw her. She was sitting on a stool, reading, her back to me. A red string stretched from her wrist, glowing faintly in the dim light, and wound straight toward me. She turned when she noticed me there, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. I know you, she said softly, as though testing the words. I think you do, I replied, the string between us humming with quiet energy. Did you follow it? She asked, holding up her wrist. I nodded. Yeah, I didn't think I would, but I did. She smiled then, a small, curious smile that made the air feel warmer. I was waiting to see if you would. Outside, the world seemed to shift, as though gears had fallen into place. For the first time in days, the string on my wrist felt light and still. Fate had brought us here, but as I sat across from her, watching her flip through the pages of an old, dust-covered book, I realized something. Fate might bring you to a moment, but what happens next is entirely up to you. So here's my question. If you woke up with a red string tied to your wrist and a chance to follow it, would you? Or would you fight against fate, wondering forever what lay at the end of the thread? It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day where nothing seemed particularly exciting. I just finished lunch and was walking back to work, headphones in, zoning out to some lo-fi beats, when I spotted it, a door. Just a door. Standing alone on a patch of grass next to an abandoned lot, as if someone had picked it up out of a house and dropped it there for no good reason. It wasn't attached to anything. No walls, no frame, not even a hint of a foundation. It was an old wooden door, painted teal with peeling edges, complete with a tarnished brass doorknob and a little plaque that read, "The Exit." I stopped walking, pulled out my headphones, and stared at it, half expecting someone to pop out and yell, "Surprise! You're on pranked." But the street was quiet, and no cameras were lurking. Now, I'm a curious person by nature, and this door pushed every single curiosity button in my brain. I did a little 360 around it. No tricks, no hinges hiding wires, just a regular, out-of-place door standing in the grass like it belonged there. I even knocked on it, twice, because apparently that's what you do when you meet a mysterious, freestanding door. And then I did the dumb thing. I turned the knob. To this day, I don't know what I expected. Maybe I thought it'd be locked, or maybe I thought I'd open it and see, like, the other side of the field through the doorway. But when I pushed it open, I didn't see the lot behind it. I saw a hallway. Not a normal hallway either. It was narrow and dark, stretching further than seemed physically possible. The walls were made of smooth, gray stone, and there was a faint golden light flickering at the very end, like a candle burning low. A gust of air, cool and dry, rushed past me, and I swear it smelled old. Like books no one had touched for a century, or the inside of an attic where time collects dust. I probably should have run. I should have closed the door and pretended I hadn't seen it, like any rational adult would do. But I stood there for a moment, listening to the faint sound of something. Whispers. Coming from far down the hallway, and then I did the second dumb thing. I stepped through. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the door swung shut behind me with a heavy thud. I spun around, but there was nothing. No teal door, no patch of grass, just solid stone where I'd come in. Great, I muttered to myself. This is how people go missing on true crime podcasts. With no better options, I started walking toward the flickering light. The whispers grew louder the farther I went, but I couldn't make out any words. It wasn't threatening, though. More like the soft hum of a dozen conversations happening just out of earshot. The hallway eventually opened up into a massive, circular room with a domed ceiling that looked impossibly high, like I'd walked into the inside of a cathedral. The walls were lined with doors, hundreds of them, each one slightly different. Some were wooden, some were steel, some were ornate with carvings of symbols I didn't recognize. One door was bright red with a gold lion's head for a knocker. Another looked like it had been made out of living vines, twisting and curling into place. And at the center of the room stood a tall, narrow pedestal with a single brass key resting on top of it. "Welcome, traveler," a voice said, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once, echoing softly against the stone. I turned in circles, trying to find its source, but I was alone. "What is this place?" I asked aloud, because talking to disembodied voices in strange rooms is apparently just who I am now. "This is the crossing," the voice replied. "The place between places. Each door leads somewhere different. A choice, a chance, a consequence. You are free to pick one." I stared at the key. It gleamed in the low light, begging to be picked up. "What happens if I don't?" "Then you remain," the voice said simply, "until you choose." I looked at the hundreds of doors surrounding me. A choice, a chance, a consequence. My heart pounded in my chest as I wondered what could be behind them. A door to another country? Another time? Another world? Would I step through and find myself in a desert, a jungle, a snow-covered tundra? Or would I open one to find nothing at all? And if I picked the wrong door? I asked. There are no wrong doors, the voice replied. Only doors you are not ready for. Cryptic, comforting, not at all helpful. I reached for the key. It was cool and heavy in my hand, and as soon as I touched it, one of the doors, a simple wooden one with a brass handle, creaked open across the room. I hesitated. Whatever was on the other side, I'd chosen it, even if I didn't know how. I walked toward the door, pausing at the threshold. Beyond it, I could see sunlight, a blue sky, trees that swayed gently in the breeze, and a field stretching out farther than I could see. It was beautiful, but it was also unknown. I turned back, half expecting to see the stone room behind me, but there was nothing. Just the field now, just forward. And then, before I could second-guess myself, I stepped through. I wish I could tell you I found answers. Why the door was there, why I was chosen, what the crossing even is, but I didn't. The door vanished behind me, leaving me alone in a place I didn't recognize. I spent the next few hours wandering through that field, feeling both awestruck and terrified, before I stumbled upon a small village at the edge of a forest. The people there welcomed me like they'd been waiting for me. They offered me food and water and spoke in riddles about travelers and the crossing and how I'd earned my passage. I didn't understand, and I still don't. Eventually, I found my way back, or maybe I chose my way back. One morning, there was a teal door waiting for me at the edge of the village, standing alone like the first one had. I stepped through it, and suddenly I was back in the abandoned lot, the sun setting as if no time had passed at all. Sometimes, when I'm walking down the street or passing an alleyway, I catch a glimpse of something out of place. A door where there shouldn't be one. A shadow that flickers in a way shadows shouldn't, and I wonder if it's calling me again. If I'd go back. If I'd choose differently. So, tell me this. If you stumbled across a door to nowhere, would you open it? And if you did, would you walk through? Because I can tell you one thing. It changes you, whether you're ready or not. This morning, I woke up to find that time had been misplaced. It wasn't gone exactly, just scattered. Like someone had knocked it off a shelf and forgotten to pick up the pieces. Outside my window, morning was sitting in one corner of the sky. Night had claimed another, and the afternoon lounged lazily in between, wearing sunglasses and sipping lemonade. Is this going to be a problem? I asked the clock on my nightstand. Not for me, it replied, spinning its hands in lazy circles. I'm union. I get paid whether or not I'm accurate. I rolled out of bed and landed somewhere unexpected, not the floor. Instead, I found myself knee-deep in a field of ankle-high waves that glimmered like liquid silver. The bed had disappeared, and my bedroom walls had politely excused themselves to make room for the horizon, which now stretched out infinitely in all directions. Hello? I called. The air hummed back, carrying echoes of laughter from somewhere far away. A small wooden boat appeared beside me, rising out of the waves like it had always been there. It bobbed patiently, its oars moving on their own, as if offering me a lift. You're running late, the boat informed me. Late for what? For wherever you're going, it said, and I climbed in because arguing with boats never gets you anywhere. The water didn't behave like water. It wasn't wet, for one thing, and it smelled faintly of old paper and forgotten songs. As the boat rowed itself forward, small objects floated past, things that shouldn't have been there. A pocket watch ticking backwards, a key with no lock, a paper crane flapping its wings but never getting off the ground. Lost things, the boat said when it noticed me staring. Whose are they? Everyone's, it replied. Eventually, the water gave way to a forest, not abruptly, but seamlessly, like the trees had grown up from beneath the waves. They weren't normal trees, either. Their trunks were made of glass, and their branches reached upward like frozen lightning. Birds flew between them, but they left trails of ink in the air, sentences forming and unraveling as they passed. Watch your thoughts here, the boat warned as I stepped onto the shore. The forest likes to borrow them. What happens if it keeps them? The boat didn't answer. It just sank quietly into the silver waves, leaving me alone with the trees. I started walking. The forest whispered as I moved, branches clinking like distant wind chimes. Words hung in the air, disjointed but beautiful. Once forgotten, twice remembered. What you lose will find you again. I thought I understood until I didn't. After a while, I came to a clearing where a bonfire was burning without flames. Its light was cold and soft, like moonlight trapped in a jar, and it cast no shadows. Around it sat a circle of people. Or maybe they weren't people. Their faces were blank slates, smooth and featureless, like unfinished statues. One of them held out a cup, and when I took it, I realized it was full of stardust, glittering and heavy. "What is this?" I asked. "Memory," the figure said, though I couldn't tell where its voice was coming from. "Drink, and you'll know where you are." I hesitated. "And if I don't drink? Then you'll never know why you came." The fire crackled softly, and I felt a pull, like the answer was sitting just beyond my reach, waiting for me to choose. I lifted the cup to my lips and took a small sip. It tasted like the first time someone said my name, like warm summer nights and rain-soaked pavement, like something I'd forgotten I loved. When I opened my eyes, the forest was gone. I stood at the edge of a vast library, its shelves stretching into infinity. The books were alive, their pages fluttering and murmuring softly, each one containing a story waiting to be told. A librarian sat behind a desk made of roots, their hands sorting through a pile of bookmarks. "You're late," the librarian said without looking up. "So I've heard," I replied. "Late for what?" The librarian finally met my gaze, and I saw that their eyes were filled with stars. "Late to meet yourself." "I don't understand," I said, though something deep in my chest told me that I did. The librarian pointed to a narrow door at the far end of the room. "You will." I walked toward it, passing books that whispered secrets as I moved. Some of their titles stood out. "The Day You Almost Turned Back," "The Choice You Didn't Realize You Made," "Everything You're Afraid to Say Out Loud." I reached the door and hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. "What's on the other side?" I called back. The librarian's voice echoed softly through the library, "Only what you're ready to find." I pushed the door open. On the other side was a room I knew instantly, my childhood bedroom. The walls were covered in faded posters. Toys I'd forgotten sat scattered across the floor, waiting for me like old friends. Sunlight streamed through the window, golden and warm, as if time itself had come to rest. In the center of the room sat a small version of me, 7 years old, cross-legged and quietly coloring. They looked up as I entered, their eyes widening with recognition. "I was waiting for you," they said. "For what?" "To remember," they replied simply. They held out a drawing they'd been working on. It was a picture of a door, half open, with light spilling out from the other side. I took the drawing and sat down beside them, the floor soft beneath me. "What happens now?" I asked. "You take this with you," they said, tapping the paper. "And you don't forget again." When I woke up, I was back in my bed, the ceiling in its usual place. The world outside the window looked normal, but something was different, like the air had been rearranged while I slept. On my nightstand sat the drawing of the door, the lines still smudged where small hands had colored it in. I tucked it into my pocket before leaving the room, just in case I needed a reminder that sometimes the strangest places bring us back to ourselves. The invitation was a paper airplane. I'd been sitting at my desk at work, nursing a lukewarm coffee and trying to make sense of a spreadsheet, when it appeared out of nowhere. It glided in from over the cubicle wall, landed on my keyboard, and unfolded to reveal a note written in sharp, hurried handwriting. "Meet me at the park on Elm at 6:45 p.m. Don't eat dinner. This is important." There was no name, but I knew exactly who it was. Henry from IT. The guy who once rewired a coffee machine to play Eye of the Tiger when it brewed. We'd been bantering for weeks, little moments stolen over printer jams and accidentally deleted files, but I hadn't expected him to escalate our flirtation into something as intriguing and bizarre as this. At exactly 6:45, I arrived at the park, half convinced I was about to stumble into a flash mob or some elaborate prank. Instead, I found him waiting by the fountain, holding 2 paper bags and wearing a nervous grin. "You came," he said, holding up one of the bags like it was a prize. "Barely," I replied, gesturing at my heels. "Next time, maybe pick somewhere closer to a bench?" He laughed. "Noted. But tonight, we're walking and eating." He handed me one of the bags. Inside was a hot, gooey grilled cheese sandwich. Not fancy, not gourmet, just perfectly buttery, with a crispy edge that made me want to devour it on the spot. "Grilled cheese?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Not just grilled cheese," he said, wagging a finger. "Grilled cheese is the most nostalgic food on the planet. Think about it. Everyone has a grilled cheese memory. It's the great equalizer of sandwiches." I couldn't argue with that logic, so I took a bite. It was delicious. As we walked, Henry reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, round device I didn't recognize. "Now," he said, holding it up dramatically, "we activate Phase 2. Phase 2. He pressed a button, and the device began to glow faintly, emitting soft chimes that reminded me of wind catching glass. It took me a second to realize what it was, a portable projector. He pointed it at a nearby brick wall, and suddenly, an image burst to life. A slideshow of vintage photographs of carnivals, each one shifting to the next with the sound of a carousel in the background. "What is this?" I asked, staring at the flickering images. "This," he said, "is my granddad's photo collection. He used to travel to old fairs and take pictures. He swore there was magic in them. Thought I'd share a little magic tonight." The pictures were mesmerizing. A Ferris wheel lit up against a pink sunset. A girl holding a balloon shaped like an elephant. A clown juggling flaming batons with an expression that was somehow both terrifying and endearing. "Why fairs?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Because," he said, shifting the projector to a new wall. He said they felt like life boiled down to its best parts. Colorful, chaotic, a little unpredictable. It wasn't just the pictures, though. He had music to go with them, soft, crackling recordings of an old calliope organ, and as we walked from wall to wall, he kept changing the settings, pulling out new images, new sounds. It felt like we were stepping into tiny pockets of a forgotten world, one where everything was a little brighter and a little stranger. When the slideshow ended, he tucked the projector back into his pocket and looked at me expectantly. "So," he said, "was that the most interesting dinner entertainment you've ever had?" "Not bad," I admitted, though I was grinning, "but I still don't see how this qualifies as dinner." He gasped, clutching his chest in mock offense. "Grilled cheese and history? Tough crowd. Good thing we've got Phase 3. He led me to the other side of the park, where a small table had been set up under a tree draped with string lights. There was no one else around, just the faint hum of the city in the distance. On the table were 2 plates covered with silver domes, which he revealed with a theatrical flourish. "Voila," he said, grinning. "Dessert." It was ice cream, vanilla for me, pistachio for him, but not just any ice cream. Each scoop was nestled in a waffle cone shaped like a tiny Ferris wheel car. "You made this?" I asked, incredulous. "Technically," he said, "I bribed my friend who works at the bakery to make it, but I did carry it here without dropping it, which I think deserves some credit." We sat under the lights, eating ice cream and laughing about everything from carnival mishaps to the time I accidentally deleted my entire inbox at work. He had a way of talking that made every moment feel like an inside joke, even when the joke wasn't clear. And then, just as we finished, he pulled something out of his other pocket, a tiny strip of tickets. "What are these for?" I asked, taking one. "Rides," he said, leaning back in his chair with a sly grin. "There are no rides here." "Not yet," he said, standing up and offering me his hand. "But they'll show up eventually. You just have to keep an eye out." I looked at him, trying to decide if he was serious. He wasn't, of course, but something about the way he said it made me want to believe him anyway. We spent the rest of the night wandering the park, making up imaginary rides for the tickets. A carousel where the horses told jokes. A roller coaster that inverted your memories instead of your body. A haunted house where the ghosts taught you how to dance. By the time I got home, I was still laughing, the paper ticket tucked into my jacket pocket. When I pulled it out later, I noticed he'd written something on the back in that same sharp handwriting. The next ride opens Saturday. Same time, same park. Have you ever been on a date so unexpected that it felt like a ride you never wanted to get off? The postcard arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a stack of bills and a glossy pizza coupon. It was old-fashioned, the kind with scalloped edges and slightly faded colors. On the front was a photo of a beach, a long stretch of sand curving into an impossibly blue horizon. A line of palm trees bent in unison, their fronds frozen mid-sway. The scene was generic, the kind you'd find in a rack at a gas station, but the back was what caught my attention. There was no return address, no stamp, just my name, scrawled in looping, hurried handwriting I didn't recognize. Wish you were here. That was it. I stared at it for a long time, turning it over in my hands. The paper felt strange, softer than it should have been, like it had been handled 100 times before reaching me. There was a faint smell, too, not ink or paper, but salt. It clung to my fingers, sharp and briny, the way the ocean does when you're standing too close. I didn't think much of it at first. Probably some marketing gimmick or a weird joke. Still, I propped it up on the windowsill. Something about it made me feel watched. That night, I dreamed of the beach. It wasn't like the one on the postcard, not exactly. It was brighter, more vivid, like someone had cranked up the saturation on reality. The sand was golden, almost glowing, and the waves glittered like broken glass. The air was warm and sticky, filled with the sound of gulls crying and the rhythmic rush of the tide. I was standing there, barefoot and confused, when I noticed the figure in the distance. They were just a silhouette at first, backlit by the sun, but as they walked closer, I realized it wasn't just one person. It was several, a group of them, scattered along the shoreline, their faces turned away from me. One of them was holding a postcard. I woke up gasping, the sound of waves still crashing in my ears. The postcard was gone. I tore through the kitchen, pulling out drawers and flipping through the stack of mail I hadn't yet thrown away, but it wasn't there. My windowsill, where I'd left it, was clean, too clean, like no one had touched it in years. For the next week, nothing happened. I tried to convince myself it had all been a fluke, that I'd misplaced the card and dreamed the rest. But every night, I dreamed of the beach. It always started the same. Me standing at the water's edge, staring at the impossibly bright ocean. The group would be there, too, wandering along the shore with slow, deliberate movements. I'd call out to them, but my voice never carried, swallowed by the crashing waves. And every time, they were closer. By the fifth night, I could see their faces. They weren't quite right, too smooth, like porcelain dolls, their expressions frozen in vague smiles. Their eyes didn't blink, and their mouths didn't move. But somehow, I knew they were speaking to each other, communicating. They wanted me to join them. When I woke up that morning, the postcard was back. It was sitting on my desk this time, angled just so, as though it had been placed there intentionally. My name was still written on the back, but the ink had bled, the letters smudged into unrecognizable shapes. And beneath the words, a set of coordinates. I looked them up. They pointed to a stretch of coastline a few hours from where I lived, a secluded beach I'd never heard of before. I should have thrown the postcard away. I should have burned it, shredded it, buried it deep in the trash, and never thought about it again. Instead, I got in my car. The drive was uneventful, the highway unspooling beneath my tires like a thread leading me somewhere I wasn't sure I wanted to go. When I finally reached the beach, the sun was low in the sky, casting long, golden shadows across the sand. It was empty. No tourists, no families with colorful umbrellas, no lifeguards perched in their towers. Just the ocean, vast and endless, and the faint whisper of wind weaving through the palm trees. I stepped onto the sand, half expecting it to glow like it had in my dreams. It didn't, but the air smelled the same, salty, heavy, familiar. I wandered along the shore, scanning the horizon for any sign of the figures. Nothing, just water and sky, stretching forever. And then I saw it, the postcard, half buried in the sand. I dug it out, my fingers trembling, and turned it over. The back was blank, except for a single word written in bold, black letters. Run. The sound hit me before I could move. It wasn't the wind, or the waves, or the cry of distant gulls. It was a low, deep hum, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. I turned toward the water, and that's when I saw them. The figures from my dreams. They were standing at the edge of the tide, perfectly still, their porcelain faces turned toward me. There were more of them now. Dozens, maybe hundreds, stretching in a long line that curved with the shoreline. They didn't move, but I could feel them watching. Then, as one, they began to walk toward me. The hum grew louder, rattling in my chest as the tide surged forward, rushing around their ankles but never slowing them down. I ran. I didn't look back, not once, as I sprinted toward my car, the postcard clenched tight in my fist. The sound followed me all the way to the highway, a deep, resonant thrum that didn't fade until I was miles from the beach. When I got home, the postcard was gone again. I don't know what they wanted, or why they sent it to me, but every time I close my eyes, I see them standing at the water's edge, their porcelain faces glowing in the sunlight. And every morning, I wake up to the smell of salt. The first time I met Danny, she was arguing with a tree. Not in a poetic, deep thinker way either. Like she wasn't pondering the meaning of nature or admiring the majesty of the universe. No, she was standing in the middle of the park, hands on her hips, yelling at a tree. "Okay, very funny," she shouted, her voice laced with exasperation. "I know you have it. Just give it back, and we'll call it even." I was out for a run, so naturally, I stopped dead in my tracks. Who wouldn't? There she was, a petite girl with a braid that kept unraveling as the wind whipped it around her face, her sneakers half sunk into the dirt, demanding a tree own up to its crimes. She kicked the base of it lightly, like it might apologize. "Excuse me?" I asked, before I could stop myself. She turned around so quickly she almost lost her balance. "What are you?" I gestured toward the tree. "Is everything okay here?" "Do I look like everything's okay?" she snapped, and then immediately softened, sighing. "Sorry, it's not you. It's the tree." "Right?" I said cautiously. She took a deep breath, as if preparing to explain something that shouldn't require explaining. "It stole my keys." I blinked. "The tree stole your keys?" "Yes," she exclaimed, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "I set them down for 2 seconds, right there on that little patch of roots, and now they're gone. I've checked everywhere. It's like the tree just ate them." "I couldn't help it," I laughed. She glared at me, but it was hard to take her seriously with that wild braid, and the way she kept glancing at the tree like it was a particularly uncooperative toddler. "I don't think trees eat keys," I said. She threw up her hands. "Oh, you're a botanist now?" "No," I said, grinning. "Just a guy who doesn't think the Lorax is out here committing petty theft." For a moment, she looked like she might hit me. But then, to my surprise, she laughed. A short, sharp burst, like I'd caught her off guard. "Fine," she said, kneeling by the roots again. "But if I find out this tree has a secret stash of car keys, I'm coming back for you so you can apologize." "Deal," I said, and before I could stop myself, I added, "Need help?" To my surprise, she nodded. We spent the next 20 minutes combing through the dirt and leaves around the tree while she grumbled about nature's betrayal. Eventually, I found her keys tucked under a particularly fat root, almost completely hidden. "Oh, thank God," she said, snatching them up. "You're a hero. If you hadn't been here, I'd probably be out here all night accusing squirrels of grand larceny." "Glad I could help," I said, still grinning. "So, do you always get into fights with plants, or is this a one-time thing?" She narrowed her eyes at me but couldn't quite hide her smile. "You'd be surprised how often it happens." And just like that, Danny walked into my life. Over the next few months, I kept running into her. It wasn't intentional at first. Our neighborhood was small, and the park seemed to be her favorite haunt. Sometimes I'd see her balancing on the edge of the fountain like a tightrope walker. Other times, she'd be lying flat on the grass, staring up at the sky like it was telling her secrets. Once, I saw her reading a book to a dog that definitely wasn't hers. Each time, she'd wave me over like we were old friends, and somehow, I'd find myself sitting next to her, listening to her latest adventure. Danny had this way of making every story sound like an epic tale. A broken umbrella wasn't just bad luck. It was the final betrayal of a long and tumultuous relationship. A missed train wasn't an inconvenience. It was the universe's way of steering me towards something cooler. She could turn the most mundane events into the kind of stories that made you laugh until your ribs hurt. She was also a magnet for chaos. One time, we went for coffee, and she somehow managed to spill her entire drink into her shoe. Another time, she tried to take a shortcut through an alley and ended up locked in a gated courtyard for 2 hours. "Do you try to make your life a sitcom?" I asked her once, after she tripped over a rogue garden gnome and fallen into a patch of tulips. She shrugged, brushing dirt off her jeans. "I think the universe just likes messing with me." But the thing about Danny was that she didn't let the chaos get to her. If anything, she seemed to thrive on it. She had this unshakable optimism, like no matter how ridiculous or frustrating things got, she'd find a way to laugh about it. And being around her made it impossible not to laugh, too. The turning point came on a rainy Saturday, when she dragged me to an art exhibit she'd heard about. "It's called Unseen Perspectives," she said, practically vibrating with excitement as we walked into the dimly lit gallery. "Apparently, it's all about seeing beauty in the ordinary." The exhibit was weird. Mirrors warped into strange shapes, abstract sculptures made from trash, photographs of cracks in the sidewalk blown up to massive proportions. I didn't get it, but Danny? She was enthralled. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a close-up photo of peeling paint on a bench. "Doesn't it look like a map of an imaginary world? Like, that could be a mountain range, and that little patch could be a forest?" I stared at it, squinting. "Sure?" She laughed, bumping my shoulder. "You're hopeless." We spent hours wandering through the gallery, Danny chattering away about hidden details and secret stories in the art. For the first time, I realized just how much she noticed. Every crack, every shadow, every imperfect, overlooked thing. She saw beauty in all of it. By the time we left, the rain had stopped, and the streets were glistening under the streetlights. Danny grabbed my hand and pulled me toward a puddle, crouching down to look at the reflection of the sky and the water. "See," she said, her voice soft. "Even puddles have their own kind of magic." I looked at her, and for the first time, I saw what she saw, not just in the puddle, but in her. The way her eyes sparkled when she talked about the world. The way her smile made everything feel lighter. "You're unbelievable," I said, and I meant it. She grinned. "Took you long enough to figure that out." Danny is still a hurricane of chaos. She still fights with trees, befriends random animals, and gets herself into the most absurd situations. But she's also the person who taught me to slow down, to see the magic in the messy, imperfect details of life. And now, every time I pass that tree in the park, I can't help but laugh. Have you ever met someone who made you see the world in a completely different way? The first time I saw the woman with the suitcase, it was 3 in the morning, and I was awake for no good reason. The world outside my window was its usual urban still life. Streetlights buzzing faintly, the odd car rolling through the dark, sidewalks empty. I had been staring at nothing, just letting my thoughts drift when she appeared. A small figure moving steadily down the center of the street. At first, I thought she was just someone caught between the bus and home, but there was something odd about her pace. It wasn't hurried, not like someone trying to get out of the cold. She walked like she had nowhere to be and nowhere to avoid. She carried a small, battered suitcase in one hand and swung it gently, like a child might swing a lunchbox. I watched her pass beneath the street lamp outside my building. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, the kind you see in movies set decades ago. Its hem brushing her ankles. Her hair was pinned up neatly, and she moved with an eerie calm. The strangest part, though, was how the streetlight reacted when she passed beneath it. For the briefest moment, it dimmed, just slightly, as though the light were folding away from her presence. Then she disappeared around the corner, and I was alone again. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, some wandering insomniac. But even after I crawled back into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to. The next night, I stayed up. I didn't mean to. I just kept finding reasons to avoid sleep. At 2:58 a.m., I moved to the window and waited. Sure enough, at 3 o'clock on the dot, the woman appeared again, her figure small and dark against the empty road. She walked the same way, slow and steady, suitcase swinging. When she passed beneath the street lamp, it dimmed again, just for a second, and my stomach twisted. This wasn't normal. I didn't tell anyone. How do you explain that a woman with a suitcase walks past your building every night at exactly the same time, and the lights dim when she moves beneath them? You don't. You keep it to yourself, the way you do with dreams that feel too sharp to share. But the third night, I couldn't resist. I grabbed my coat and went outside. The air was colder than it should have been for spring. My breath fogged in the darkness as I crossed the street and stood beside the street lamp, waiting. I didn't have to wait long. At exactly 3, I heard footsteps, soft, rhythmic taps echoing down the empty road. She appeared at the far end of the block, her silhouette sharp against the glow of distant headlights. I couldn't move. She came closer, closer still, and for the first time, I saw her face. It was unremarkable, plain and pale, like someone who'd been drawn with too few details. Her eyes, though, were another story. They were dark, too dark, like they were holding something back, some void too deep for me to understand. She didn't look at me. She walked right past, her suitcase brushing the edge of my coat as she passed beneath the street lamp. The light dimmed, and the temperature dropped so suddenly my teeth chattered. She turned the corner, and I was alone again. That night, I dreamt of empty train stations. The tracks were rusted, stretching into miles of fog, and the air was filled with a low, mechanical hum. I stood on the platform, clutching a suitcase identical to the one the woman carried. I had no memory of packing it, but I knew it belonged to me. A bell rang, 3 sharp, metallic chimes, and the dream dissolved like smoke. I woke up covered in sweat, my heart hammering. It was 5:47 a.m., but I felt like I hadn't rested at all. When I stood up, my feet knocked against something under my bed. I bent down to look. It was a suitcase. The same suitcase. Small, battered, brown leather. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. I stood there for a full 5 minutes, staring at it like it might grow teeth and bite me. When I finally got the nerve to lift it, the thing was heavier than it looked. I placed it on the bed, my hands trembling, and unlatched the buckles. Inside, there were no clothes, no papers, just a small brass key, lying in the center of the suitcase like it had been waiting for me. The key was cold, unnaturally so, and when I held it, I swear I felt something shift, like the weight of the room itself had tilted. I didn't sleep the next night, or the night after. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman walking, the way the light folded away from her, the way her eyes held a darkness that made me feel like I was falling. The suitcase sat in the corner of my room, the key inside it, and I kept waiting for something to happen. I felt like a thread being pulled tighter and tighter, but I didn't know where the tension was leading me. On the 6th night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the suitcase and the key, threw on my coat, and left the apartment. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to move. The streets were empty, so empty it felt unnatural. Even in the dead of night, the city usually hums with life. But now there was nothing. No cars, no sirens, not even a breeze. It was as though the entire world had paused, holding its breath for what came next. I followed the road without thinking, and soon I found myself in front of the train station. It wasn't where I'd meant to go, but I wasn't surprised to find it waiting for me. The platform was empty, the ticket booths abandoned, and the rusted tracks stretched endlessly into the dark. I stepped onto the platform, the suitcase heavy in my hand. The bell rang, 3 sharp chimes that made my bones vibrate. From somewhere far down the tracks, a train's headlight flared to life, cutting through the fog. It rolled forward, silent and slow, a massive black engine pulling cars that stretched too far to count. It stopped in front of me, the doors sliding open without a sound. "All aboard," a voice said. The woman was standing there, just inside the train, her pale face as blank as before. Her suitcase hung at her side, identical to mine, and when she turned, I saw her step onto the train and disappear into the shadows. I don't remember deciding to follow her. My feet just moved. I climbed the steps and entered the carriage. The air inside was colder, heavy with a faint metallic smell. The seats were full of people, their faces turned toward the windows, their bodies perfectly still. None of them looked at me. I walked down the aisle until I found an empty seat and sat down. My suitcase felt even heavier now, like it was full of stones. The train began to move. Outside the window, the world was no longer the city I knew. There were no streets, no buildings, only a dark, endless expanse stretching into forever. The faint glow of something distant flickered on the horizon, too far to see clearly. The woman was sitting across from me now. I hadn't seen her move, but she was there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. "Where are we going?" I asked. She tilted her head slightly, the barest hint of something like a smile tugging at her lips. "Forward," she said. I looked down at the suitcase in my lap. The brass key was warm now, as though it had been waiting for this. Outside the window, the darkness seemed to move, shapes shifting just beyond the edge of perception, and the hum of the train filled my ears until it was the only sound I could hear. The train rolled on. The town of Larkspur had one rule: never open the door after midnight. It wasn't something written in a guidebook or posted on signs, but everyone knew it. Doors stayed bolted, windows stayed shuttered, and if you heard knocking, 3 sharp raps, always 3, you ignored it. When Evie moved to Larkspur, she thought the rule was quaint, like something out of a folklore podcast she used to listen to on long drives. She laughed it off when the realtor mentioned it. "It's just a silly tradition," the woman had said with a tight smile. But her eyes, Evie noticed, darted nervously toward the clock. That first week in her new house, Evie was too busy unpacking to care. The house was a small, cozy thing perched at the edge of the woods. Quiet, exactly what she wanted. The neighbors were polite but distant, the kind of people who waved but didn't ask questions. The first time she heard the knocking, it was 12:13 a.m. Evie was sitting on the couch, scrolling her phone, the flickering glow of a candle her only light. She had been trying to unwind, ignoring the faint unease that settled over her as night fell. When the sound came, 3 sharp raps on the front door, she froze. Her immediate thought was that it was a mistake, someone knocking on the wrong house. But as the seconds dragged on, her body stiffened with a different feeling, a deeper one, something primal. The house seemed to exhale around her, the walls groaning faintly in the silence. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaking slightly. No answer. The wind outside rustled the leaves, but no footsteps, no voices, just silence. She approached the door slowly, her heart hammering. Through the peephole, she saw nothing, just the shadowed porch, the dark expanse of her yard, and the woods beyond. No one was there. She bolted the door and went to bed, her stomach knotted. Maybe it was kids pulling a prank. Maybe the realtor hadn't warned her about that part of small-town living. She convinced herself it was nothing and tried to sleep. The second night, it happened again. 3 knocks. This time, they were louder, more deliberate, as though the knocker was closer. She didn't go to the door. Instead, she sat on the couch, clutching her phone like a lifeline, staring at the clock as it ticked past 12:15. The knocking didn't come again, but neither did sleep. By the third night, Evie decided to ask someone. She found herself at the diner the next morning, nursing a lukewarm coffee while the waitress, an older woman with tired eyes, refilled her cup. "Do people knock on doors at night here?" Evie asked hesitantly. The waitress stilled for a fraction of a second, her hand hovering over the coffee pot. "Did you hear something?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Evie forced a laugh. "Probably just kids. Or maybe an animal." The waitress glanced at the other patrons, then leaned in close. "If you hear it again, don't answer. Don't even look. Just wait for it to stop." Evie blinked. "Why?" The waitress straightened, her lips tightening. "You're new. You'll figure it out." That night, Evie stayed awake on purpose, the lights dimmed and her nerves raw. She kept glancing at the clock, waiting for midnight to come and go. When the first knock came, soft but deliberate, she jumped, her breath catching in her throat. The clock read 12:03. The knocks came again, harder this time. She covered her ears, trying to drown them out, but they seemed to echo through the house, growing louder, more insistent. 3. Pause. 3. Pause. The air felt heavier, charged, as if the house itself were holding its breath. And then she heard it, the faintest whisper, just beyond the door. Evie. She bolted upright. Her name. It had said her name. Her legs carried her to the door before her mind could stop her. She pressed her ear to the wood, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Who's there?" she whispered. Silence. She glanced at the peephole, her hand hovering over it. Just one look, she thought. Just one. When she peered through, she saw a man standing on her porch. He was smiling, his teeth too white, his eyes too wide. Something about him felt wrong, like a doll painted to look human but failing. He raised a hand, waving slowly and mouthed, "Open." Evie stumbled back, her breath hitching. The doorknob rattled as if something on the other side was testing it. She didn't sleep that night. The following day, she walked into the woods. It wasn't planned. She just needed to escape the house. The trees stretched high above her, their shadows weaving a canopy that swallowed the sunlight. She walked until the path disappeared, until the air turned colder, sharper. That's when she saw it. A door. It stood alone in the middle of the forest, tall and black, with intricate carvings etched into the wood. There was no building, no frame, just the door, impossibly upright, its brass handle gleaming. She stepped closer, her heart pounding. The carvings weren't random. They were faces, hundreds of them, their expressions twisted in agony and fear. A sound came from behind the door, a faint, familiar melody, like a music box playing a half-remembered tune. And then came the knock. 3 sharp raps, echoing through the forest. Evie ran. She didn't stop until she was back in her house, locking the doors, pulling the curtains tight. That night, when the knocking came again, she didn't answer. She didn't go to the door, didn't look through the peephole, but as the sound faded, she heard a new one, a soft creak, like hinges turning, and when she turned toward the hallway, she saw it. The black door, standing where her bedroom door should have been, waiting, and this time, it was open. It started with a single, innocuous beep. I was in my living room, lounging on the couch, fully prepared to let the rest of my Saturday dissolve into the warm embrace of Netflix. That's when it happened. The beep, short, high-pitched, and coming from somewhere in my apartment. I paused, tilted my head like a confused dog, and waited. Another beep. This was no ordinary beep. It wasn't the smoke alarm, the fridge, or the microwave. No, this was the beep of something new, something unfamiliar. It had the kind of confidence that says, "I'm not going to stop until you deal with me." I put down the remote and began my search, wandering from room to room like an amateur ghost hunter. Beep, beep. The sound had an almost mocking quality, as if it knew I had no idea what I was looking for. Finally, I pinpointed the source, my air purifier. I knelt down, squinting at the glowing interface like it was the dashboard of a spaceship. The display read, "Filter needs replacement. Your air deserves better." My air deserves better? It was a machine, scolding me, dripping with judgment, as if I'd been knowingly pumping smog into my apartment just to spite it. "Fine," I muttered, grabbing my phone to look up replacement filters. But before I could search, a notification popped up, "Don't forget to hydrate," from the water tracking app one downloaded months ago and immediately forgot about. I looked at the glass of water sitting untouched on my coffee table and thought, I am being bullied by machines. I ordered the filter, drank the water, out of spite, and decided I needed to get out of the apartment. Stepping outside, I took a deep breath of what I could only assume was subpar air. According to my purifier, my smartwatch buzzed immediately, "Workout detected. Outdoor walk. Keep it up." I hadn't even made it down the stairs, but sure, let's call that a workout. The weather was perfect, but I couldn't help noticing how weirdly staged everything looked. A woman jogged by with a neon water bottle that was somehow the exact shade of her leggings. A man sat at a cafe table, his latte art so perfect it looked like it had been photoshopped in real time. Even the local florist had arranged their sidewalk display to look like it had been curated for Instagram. Wildflowers in soft focus, sunlight streaming through at a suspiciously cinematic angle. As I walked, my phone buzzed again. It was my grocery app, informing me I had points to redeem for free bananas. Free bananas. This, apparently, was the pinnacle of my digital loyalty. I couldn't remember the last time I'd even bought bananas, but now I had an inexplicable urge to claim them. I changed course, heading straight for the store, lured by the promise of potassium and a fleeting sense of victory. When I arrived, the grocery store was a symphony of unnecessary innovation. Shiny self-checkout kiosks chirped happily, while an automated robot zipped through the aisles, restocking shelves with a level of efficiency that made the humans look bad. My phone buzzed yet again. Welcome back. Check out these personalized deals. Personalized? The first deal was for cat food. I don't own a cat. The second was for a brand of almond butter that costs more than a decent steak. The third was for kombucha. Kombucha. My phone thought I was the kind of person who drinks fermented tea on purpose. I grabbed my free bananas, resisted the almond butter, and made my way to the exit. As I walked out, a small delivery drone zipped by overhead, carrying what looked like a single cupcake in a tiny plastic dome. That's where we are now. Cupcakes by air. Back home, I found my neighbor standing outside her apartment, glaring at her video doorbell. Everything okay? I asked. No, she said, pointing at the device. It keeps sending me notifications every time a leaf blows past. As if on cue, her phone buzzed, and she sighed. Motion detected. Suspicious leaf activity. We both laughed, but as I headed inside, I realized her frustration wasn't far off from my own. We're living in a world where every single thing demands our attention, where even a doorbell and an air purifier feel entitled to our time. I set the bananas on the counter and flopped back onto the couch, ready to resume my Netflix binge. But of course, Netflix had other plans. Are you still watching? The screen asked, its tone suspiciously judgmental. Yes, Netflix, I said out loud. I am still watching. This is my third rewatch of the same show, and I am thriving. Satisfied with my defiance, I pressed play. The show began, but just as I started to settle in, my smartwatch buzzed. Time to stand up? I ignored it. A few minutes later, you've been sedentary for over an hour. Still ignored it. Finally, it buzzed again. A short walk can boost your mood. Or, I said, addressing my wrist. I could sit here and keep watching a period drama about people who can't admit their feelings. Ever think about that? The watch, mercifully, didn't reply. Eventually, I started to laugh. Not because anything on the screen was particularly funny, but because the entire day had felt like one long, absurd conversation between me and my appliances. We've created this world where everything is smart, everything has a voice, and everything wants to be noticed. My vacuum emails me maps of where it's cleaned, my fridge gives me recipe suggestions, and my phone is convinced I'm dehydrated. It's chaos. Beautiful, ridiculous chaos. And yet, somehow, I love it. What about you? What's the most absurd thing your gadgets have done lately? Because honestly, I'm starting to think they're plotting something. I didn't think much of the cat when it showed up on my fire escape. It was gray, slightly mangy, and staring at me through the window with the deadpan expression all cats have perfected. I live on the 5th floor of an old brick building, so my first thought was, how did you even get up here? My second thought was, not my problem. I pulled the blinds down and went back to eating cereal straight out of the box, but when I looked again 10 minutes later, the cat was still there, watching me, judging me. It had a small brass bell around its neck, which made it look deceptively polite. Against my better judgment, I opened the window. Shoo, I said, waving a hand at it. Go home, buddy. The cat ignored me. It stepped through the window like I had just invited it to dinner and sat squarely in the middle of my kitchen counter, as if it owned the place. I sighed. Fine, but I don't have cat food, or milk, or dignity, apparently. The cat blinked once, slowly, and I swear it smiled. For the record, I am not a cat person. I grew up with dogs, golden retrievers with names like Buddy and Max who loved chasing tennis balls and eating peanut butter off spoons. Cats are a different beast. They are small, elegant creatures with a constant air of vague menace. This one, in particular, gave off the vibe that it had seen things, that it knew things, that if push came to shove, it could sell me out to the feds for a tuna sandwich. But I didn't kick it out. Instead, I left it to its own devices, figuring it would lose interest and leave. It didn't. By nightfall, the cat had moved to my couch and was napping in a spot of sunlight that somehow still lingered through the window, even though it was dark outside. I decided to ignore it. If it was going to be weird, I could be weird too. I sat down, turned on the TV, and attempted to reassert dominance in my own home. That's when the humming started. At first, I thought it was my neighbor's washing machine or the pipes. Old buildings make old noises. But no, it was coming from the cat. The sound was low and vibrating, like an engine running in its chest, and it wasn't quite a purr. It was too deliberate for that, too steady, like something mechanical pretending to be alive. I glanced over, and the cat was watching me. Not like how cats usually watch you, bored and disinterested. This was different. Its eyes were wide and green, and there was something in them that made me freeze, like I'd been caught doing something I wasn't supposed to. "Okay," I said, pointing at it. "You're not normal." The humming stopped. The cat yawned, stretched, and then, without breaking eye contact, hopped off the couch and disappeared into the hallway. I sat there for a moment, trying to shake the feeling that I'd just been warned about something. That night, I dreamed of doors. Endless doors, stretching out in a row that curved like a spine, each one slightly different from the last. Some were polished wood with brass handles. Others were splintered and covered in peeling paint. A few were massive, tall enough to make me feel like an ant standing next to them, and others were small, barely big enough to crawl through. As I stood there, unsure which door to open, I heard the humming again. It was everywhere, vibrating through the air, growing louder and louder until I woke up, drenched in sweat. The cat was sitting at the foot of my bed, staring at me. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and for a moment, I wasn't sure I was awake. Then it stood, turned around 3 times like it was settling into a ritual, and curled up next to my feet. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, things started to shift. I don't know how else to describe it. I woke up to find the cat sitting on my kitchen table, staring intently at my toaster. "It's a toaster," I said. "It's not that interesting." The cat didn't move. As I reached past it to grab a bagel, I noticed something strange. The toaster's chrome surface didn't reflect the room like it normally would. It reflected something else entirely, a gray, foggy landscape that seemed to stretch on forever, dotted with broken, twisted trees and pools of still water. I blinked and shook my head, and it was gone. The toaster looked normal again. I turned to the cat. "What did you do?" The cat blinked, slowly, and this time there was no mistaking it. It was smiling. From then on, nothing felt quite real. The humming followed me everywhere. When I turned on the sink, the pipes groaned and hissed in a way that almost sounded like words. My phone glitched constantly, showing me notifications I didn't understand. "Don't open the door. He's watching. Close your eyes." And then there were the cracks. Tiny hairline fractures that started showing up on my walls, in my coffee mug, in the bathroom mirror. At first, they were barely noticeable, but every time I looked back, they seemed bigger, like they were spreading, like they were alive. By the 3rd day, I was losing it. I sat on the floor of my apartment, staring at the cat, who was perched on the arm of the couch like a king on a throne. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice hoarse. The cat tilted its head and stood, stretching its limbs in a way that seemed a little too human. Then it walked, no, it glided, to the hallway and stopped in front of my closet door. It sat there, humming louder than ever, its eyes locked on mine. I shook my head. "No way. I'm not opening that." The cat didn't move. It just stared, unblinking, and the humming grew louder. Against every instinct in my body, I stood up and walked toward the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob, and for a split second, I saw the cracks spreading across the surface like veins. The humming filled my ears, my bones, my thoughts. I turned the handle. The door opened, and there, behind it, was nothing. Just a void, dark and endless, stretching into forever. It wasn't the kind of dark you see when you close your eyes. It was a living darkness, a void that saw me. The humming stopped. I looked down, and the cat was gone. I was alone. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the nothing, but eventually, I slammed the door shut and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air like I'd been underwater. The next morning, the cat was gone. The cracks in the walls were gone. The toaster reflected my kitchen again, and my phone worked fine. Everything was back to normal, except me. I haven't opened that closet door since. I don't know what's on the other side, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I hear a faint humming coming from inside. And every now and then, I'll catch a glimpse of gray fur on my fire escape. The clockmaker's shop sat on the corner of a street no one remembered the name of. It was the kind of place you only stumbled upon when you weren't looking for it, as though the shop itself decided who was worthy of finding it. The windows were fogged and dusty, with gears and springs scattered in haphazard displays behind cracked glass. Above the door hung a sign that simply read "Time mended here." It wasn't an invitation. It was a warning. I found the shop on a day when my mind was a mess of jagged thoughts and regrets that refused to stay buried. I'd walked aimlessly for hours, weaving through streets I'd never seen before, until the wind pushed me toward the little corner shop. The chime above the door jingled as I stepped inside, a thin, silvery sound that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. The scent of old wood and oil filled the space, and everywhere I looked, clocks ticked. They were crammed on every surface, hanging from the walls and perched on shelves. Grandfather clocks, pocket watches, cuckoo clocks, hourglasses filled with sands of strange colors. Their ticking was not in sync. Instead, it layered over itself like an orchestra tuning its instruments, creating a rhythm both chaotic and hypnotic. Behind the counter sat an old man in a waistcoat, hunched over a small watch with a magnifying glass perched on his nose. His fingers worked with impossible precision, adjusting gears no larger than pinheads. He didn't look up when he spoke. "You're late." I blinked. "What?" "You're late," he repeated, finally lifting his head. His eyes were bright and sharp, the pale blue of winter frost. "But not so late that I can't help you. Sit." I didn't remember walking to the chair, but suddenly I was in it, sinking into something that felt far too comfortable for such a dusty, forgotten place. I glanced around uneasily. "I think there's been a mistake. I was just wandering," he interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. "That's what everyone says when they come here. Lost, aimless, burdened by a weight they don't understand." He leaned forward, clasping his hands, his gaze fixing me in place. "But you didn't stumble here by accident. People don't come to me by accident." I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "What do you mean? Who are you?" He smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "I'm a clockmaker, as you can see. But the clocks I fix are not always made of gears and glass." He tapped his temple lightly. "Sometimes they're made of memories. Sometimes they're made of regrets." Something shifted in the air, a quiet hum that made the clocks on the walls seem louder. I gripped the arms of the chair. "This is ridiculous. I should go." He raised an eyebrow. "Should you? And go where? Back to the mess you've been running from?" He tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. "You carry more broken pieces than most, you know. One moment, one choice, something small, and everything slipped off course. Didn't it?" I opened my mouth to argue, but nothing came out. How did he know? The moment he was talking about was something I tried not to think about, a mistake so small that it shouldn't have mattered, yet somehow it did. The wrong words said in anger. The phone call I didn't make. The apology I let sit too long until it curdled into silence. He stood suddenly, his movements surprisingly fluid for someone so old. "Let's take a look, shall we?" "Take a look at what?" I asked, even as he pulled a curtain aside, revealing a narrow door made of dark wood. "At your time." I hesitated. "I don't want to see it." "Of course you don't," he replied with a dry chuckle. No one does, but it's the only way forward. The door creaked open on its own, and beyond it was a narrow hallway that stretched far longer than should have been possible. The walls were lined with clocks, each one different but unmistakably mine. I stepped closer, feeling the pull of them, the faint hum of something alive inside their mechanisms. The first clock I stopped at was small and silver, its face cracked slightly at the edges. This was the day you left home, the clockmaker said, his voice soft behind me. Your mother asked you to stay for tea. You didn't. She watched you walk away and sat alone at the table. The second clock was ornate and golden, its hands stuck at a moment I remembered all too well. Here's where you let anger win. You knew it wasn't worth the fight, but you didn't stop. Words you can't take back, wounds you couldn't see. I backed away, my chest tight, but the clocks didn't stop. They lined the hall endlessly, ticking with moments both great and small. Choices I'd made, things I'd said, opportunities I'd let slip through my fingers. It wasn't just the bad moments that hurt. It was the quiet ones, the moments of almost turning back, almost saying the right thing, almost being someone better. Why are you showing me this? I demanded, spinning to face the clockmaker. What's the point? I can't change any of it. He regarded me calmly, his hands folded behind his back. Can't you? I stared at him, at the clocks, at the endless line of what was and what could have been. Time doesn't work that way. He smiled faintly. Time works any way it wants here. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a key. It was small, made of dark metal, and etched with symbols I couldn't understand. He held it out to me. What is this? A chance, he said simply, to wind one clock, just one, to revisit a moment and try again. But choose carefully, what you fix may change more than you expect. I looked at the key, then at the endless hallway of clocks. Each one ticked with a different rhythm, whispering promises, regrets, and possibilities. My heart thundered in my chest as I thought of the moments I'd give anything to change, the roads I wished I'd taken. I reached for the key. My fingers closed around the cold metal, and suddenly the clocks fell silent, the ticking replaced by a single, deafening heartbeat. My own. One chance, the clockmaker said, his voice echoing in the silence. Use it wisely. The hallway began to fade, the clocks melting into shadows as the shop swallowed me whole. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was the faint chime of a bell, ringing somewhere far, far away. And then I opened my eyes. The world was still, and I was back in my own time, holding the key to a moment I thought I'd lost forever. It began with the cat. I didn't want a cat, not at first. I didn't even particularly like cats. But it was a Tuesday morning, and I was in my usual rush, running late for work, spilling coffee on my only clean pair of pants, when I opened my front door and there it was, sitting perfectly still on the welcome mat like it belonged there. It was black, with a little patch of white under its chin like an old man's beard, and its eyes were a strange, pale green, almost silver. It stared at me, unblinking, like it had been waiting. Shoo, I said, waving my hands at it, but the cat didn't move. I sighed and stepped over it, because I didn't have time to deal with strays, and it wasn't my problem. By the time I got home that night, I'd forgotten all about it, until I opened the door. The cat was inside, sitting on my kitchen counter this time, staring at me with those pale green eyes like I was the intruder. How the hell did you get in here? I muttered, dropping my bag and looking around for an open window. Nothing. Everything was locked, just as I'd left it. The cat tilted its head. I tried to pick it up to put it outside, but the moment my hands got close, it made a sound I can only describe as a growl, low and deep, nothing like the mewing of a normal cat. It sent a chill straight through me. I backed away and grabbed a broom instead, gently nudging the cat toward the door. It didn't fight me. It jumped down, slinked out, and disappeared into the night. But the next morning, it was back, and not just sitting on my mat this time. When I opened my eyes, the cat was perched at the foot of my bed, watching me sleep. I shot upright so fast I nearly gave myself whiplash. Nope, I said, scrambling out of bed. My heart was hammering. I couldn't figure out how it kept getting inside. There were no holes, no loose screens, nothing. I picked up the cat again, despite the growl, and put it outside. I locked every door and window twice that day before leaving for work, convinced that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Every night, the cat found its way back inside. It would be sitting on the counter, curled in the sink, lounging in the corner of my room, or, most unnervingly, perched at the foot of my bed, those pale eyes gleaming in the dark. By the fourth night, I stopped sleeping. I kept all the lights on, and every creak in the apartment sent my pulse skyrocketing. It wasn't just the cat itself that unsettled me. It was the way it felt. Like the air around it was heavy and wrong, pressing on me like a weight I couldn't shake. I called animal control. They showed up with a cage and a net, humoring me as I stammered out the details. I watched them search every inch of my apartment, certain they wouldn't find the cat. But they did. It was sitting in the bathroom sink, as if it had been waiting for them. "Well, there's your problem," one of the officers said, scooping it into the cage without any trouble. "Looks like a stray. Happens all the time. Can you take it far away?" I asked, feeling stupid for how desperate I sounded. "Sure thing," he said, hauling the cage out the door. The cat didn't fight. It didn't hiss or scratch or protest. It just stared at me through the bars as they carried it away, its green-silver eyes locked on mine. That night, I slept for the first time in days, until I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, like nails on wood. I sat up, my throat dry, and stared at the bedroom door. The scratching grew louder, closer. Then came the sound of a low, rumbling growl. I didn't want to look. I knew what I would see, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned toward the foot of my bed, and there it was. The cat. But this time, it wasn't sitting. It was standing, its back arched unnaturally high, its fur bristling. Its eyes were glowing now, bright and pale like headlights cutting through fog. It opened its mouth, and the growl deepened. A sound so low it felt like it was coming from the walls. "Get out," I whispered, even though I knew it wouldn't listen. The cat took a step forward. Its paws made no sound as they touched the floor, but the weight of it pressed into my chest like something enormous and ancient. It wasn't just a cat anymore. There was something in it, something wearing it like a costume. I could feel it, a darkness that had been waiting patiently, slipping through the cracks in my life until it found the perfect way in. "Why?" I croaked, though I didn't know what I was asking. The cat tilted its head. Its gaze locked on me like it was trying to see something. Then, slowly, it opened its mouth wider and wider, until its jaw unhinged and stretched in a way no animal should. Inside, there was nothing but darkness. A void. Endless. It lunged. I don't remember what happened next. I woke up on the floor with the morning light streaming through the window, my body aching as if I'd been crushed. The cat was gone. My apartment was quiet again, too quiet, like the air had been sucked out and replaced with something still and watchful. I packed my bags that day and left the apartment. I didn't look back. I stayed in a motel 2 towns over and spent the next week jumping at shadows, expecting the cat to appear at the foot of the bed every night. But it didn't. Then, 2 days ago, I got a call from my landlord. He was confused, asking if I'd forgotten to pick up my things. "What things?" I asked. "You left the cat here," he said. I hung up without answering. This morning, I found a paw print on the hood of my car. Just one, perfectly pressed into the dust, like a signature. I know it's watching me. I know it's waiting. And I don't think it's done with me yet. If you see a black cat with pale green eyes sitting on your doorstep, don't let it in. Don't touch it. Don't even look at it too long. Because once it's chosen you, there's no getting rid of it. I don't know what it wants, but I know this. It's patient. And sooner or later, it always finds a way inside. Not just any penny. This one was stuck to the sidewalk. Not glued. Not lodged between cracks. Just stuck. I was on my lunch break, half distracted by my phone, when I noticed it shimmering in the sunlight, perfectly polished despite being in the middle of the grimiest city block in town. I bent down, curious, and tried to pry it up with my fingernail. It didn't budge. I pushed harder. Still nothing. By now, I was aware of how ridiculous I looked, crouched on the sidewalk, poking at a penny like a child. That's when the man appeared. "Careful," he said. I jumped, nearly falling backward. The man was standing a little too close, like he'd just stepped out of thin air. He was tall and thin, wrapped in a green trench coat with mismatched buttons. His face was weathered but kind, with eyes that looked older than he did, like they'd seen centuries pass by. "Careful," I repeated, straightening up and brushing off my knees. "It's just a penny." "No," he said softly, tilting his head. "It's the penny." He said it so seriously that, for a moment, I thought I'd misheard. "What do you mean, the penny?" "It's a penny." He smiled faintly and leaned in, voice low. "It's a door." I stared at him. "A door? To somewhere else," he said. "That penny opens a door, but only for someone who notices it. Someone like you." "Right?" I said, taking a step back, sure now that I was dealing with a crazy person. "Okay, well, I should probably—" "You don't believe me," he sighed, as though I were a child refusing to eat my vegetables. Then, without warning, he crouched down and tapped the penny 3 times with his knuckle. The sidewalk rippled. I blinked, my brain scrambling to catch up. The ground beneath the penny shimmered like water, spreading outward in a perfect circle, the cement turning into something liquid yet solid, an impossible surface that gleamed silver in the sunlight. The man stood back up, clearly pleased with my stunned silence. "Would you like to see what's on the other side?" he asked. I opened my mouth to say no. I should have said no, but what came out instead was, "What's there?" His smile widened just slightly. "Whatever you're missing." That sentence hit me square in the chest, the words twisting into a question I didn't want to answer. What was I missing? It felt like everything and nothing all at once. That vague ache that follows you when you're awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling. The man held out his hand. "Take a chance." And like an idiot, or a dreamer, I did. The moment my hand touched his, the rippling sidewalk solidified again. But this time, it wasn't concrete. It was smooth, metallic, and cold. Before I could pull away, the world tilted. My stomach dropped like I'd missed a step on a staircase, and suddenly, I was falling. I landed on my feet, which was a small miracle, but everything else was wrong. The sky above me wasn't a sky at all. It was gears, massive, ancient gears turning endlessly, ticking like the inside of some cosmic clock. The ground beneath me was a polished brass surface that reflected my face back at me, distorted and warped. The air hummed, alive with faint music, 1,000 notes playing at once, weaving in and out like whispers. All around me were doors. Not just regular doors. There were doors made of stained glass that pulsed like heartbeats, doors shaped like triangles that shimmered in and out of existence, doors carved into massive tree trunks that rose up into the gear sky. They stretched endlessly in every direction. "What is this place?" I asked, spinning around. The man was standing beside me, hands tucked casually in his pockets. "This," he said, "is the in-between." "The in-between?" I echoed, still staring at the impossible landscape. He gestured to the doors. "Every door leads somewhere. A memory, a possibility, a path not taken. This is where they wait." "Wait for what?" "For someone to open them." I turned to him, heart hammering. "Why me?" He shrugged. "You noticed the penny. That's usually enough." "Enough for what?" "To choose." He spread his arms as if presenting the endless maze of doors. "You get one. Only one. A door to whatever you're missing, whatever you've lost, whatever you wish you could find. But once you choose, there's no going back." My eyes drifted to the nearest door. A small, pale blue one that looked oddly familiar, though I couldn't place why. My hand twitched at my side, a strange longing bubbling up inside me. I could feel it calling to me. "What's behind that one?" I asked. "Only you know," the man said. That didn't help. "And what happens if I pick the wrong one?" He raised an eyebrow. "Who's to say what's wrong or right? All doors lead somewhere. It's up to you to decide if that's where you want to be." I looked around again, a strange mix of awe and fear twisting in my chest. One door looked like it was made of shadows, its edges swirling and flickering like smoke. Another door was covered in ivy that moved, curling lazily as though it had a mind of its own. Further down, a golden door pulsed with light, casting long beams across the brass floor. "What if I just don't pick one?" I asked, my voice small. The man's expression darkened, just for a second. "Then you stay here. Forever." I swallowed hard. The blue door was still tugging at me, pulling at a thread I couldn't see. I took a step toward it. My pulse quickened. My palms were sweaty. "What if I regret it?" I whispered. The man's smile returned, gentler this time. "Then it means you made a choice worth remembering." I hesitated for only a moment longer. Then I reached out and turned the knob. The door swung open silently, revealing sunlight. Warm, golden sunlight spilling onto my face. I stepped through. I don't know how to explain what happened next. I was standing in my childhood backyard, dappled sunlight filtering through leaves, the smell of honeysuckle hanging heavy in the air. My old swing set, crooked and rusted, creaked faintly in the breeze. The sound of laughter floated toward me, and when I turned, I saw myself, a younger version, no older than 10, chasing fireflies with a mason jar. My throat tightened. I wanted to run to her, to tell her everything I wish I'd known then. That she'd be okay, that life would get messy but beautiful, that she shouldn't lose herself trying to please everyone else. But I couldn't move. The moment stretched like an old photograph, fragile and perfect. And then the door closed behind me. When I opened my eyes again, I was standing back on the sidewalk, the penny glinting at my feet. The man was gone. I picked up the penny. It wasn't stuck anymore. I keep it in my pocket now, a reminder. Of what? I'm still not sure. Maybe that life is full of doors, of choices we don't always understand. But every now and then, I still hear the faint hum of gears turning. Like the in-between is waiting for me to notice something else. Have you ever found something small that felt like it held the weight of the entire world? It started with rain, the kind of relentless drizzle that feels personal, like the sky is mourning something it can't name. I was waiting at a bus stop, watching droplets gather on the glass shelter and race each other to the bottom. The street was nearly empty, just me, an old man feeding pigeons in the rain without an umbrella, and a woman across the street who looked like she'd stepped out of a dream. She was tall, wrapped in a coat that flared like a cloak, and holding a black umbrella that didn't seem to catch a single raindrop. I don't know why I noticed her, not at first. She didn't look at me, didn't move. She just stood there, as still as a photograph, staring at the bookstore behind her. Her umbrella tilted slightly, and a thin ribbon of smoke curled out from beneath it, winding lazily into the damp air. I blinked, thinking it was some strange trick of the weather or my tired brain. But when I looked again, it was still there. She turned her head, slowly, and for the briefest moment, I saw her eyes, gray, sharp as flint, cutting straight through me. She smiled faintly and then disappeared into the bookstore without opening the door. She just stepped through the glass like it was water. I froze. No one else seemed to notice. The old man kept tossing crumbs to the pigeons, and the bus stop remained stubbornly empty. The rain pattered gently around me, but my mind had stopped hearing it. My first thought was that I was losing it, that I'd spent too many hours staring at spreadsheets and my brain had finally cracked. My second thought was that I couldn't just leave it alone. If you see someone step through glass like it's a puddle, you follow. Or at least I do. The bookstore was old, the kind of place that had probably been there for 100 years but still smelled faintly of ink and cedar. The lights inside were dim, the shelves crooked and packed with books that looked forgotten. The woman was nowhere to be seen. I stepped inside, my shoes squeaking faintly on the wooden floor, and the door creaked shut behind me. The silence in there was heavy, like a held breath. The books felt alive, like they were watching me. There was no sign of the woman, no smoke, no magic, just aisles that stretched too far for a building that small. "Can I help you?" a voice said. I turned and found a man behind the counter, though he looked more like a relic than an employee. His face was all sharp angles, his suit too formal for the musty shop, and his eyes were the same shade of gray as the woman's, though his were dull, like tarnished silver. He was polishing an old pocket watch with deliberate precision. I just saw someone come in here," I said, hating how uncertain my voice sounded. He didn't look up. We get all kinds. Tall woman? Black umbrella? That got his attention. He set the pocket watch down and looked at me with something that might have been curiosity or suspicion. You shouldn't be here, he said quietly. The air in the shop shifted. I swear I heard a clock start ticking, though I couldn't see one anywhere. I just saw something weird, I said, feeling defensive. She walked through the window. His eyes narrowed. No one's supposed to notice. Notice what? Before he could answer, I heard something soft, like fabric brushing against wood. I turned, and there she was, standing at the end of an aisle. The woman with the umbrella. She smiled faintly, her face pale and elegant, and then turned and disappeared around the corner. Without thinking, I followed her. The aisles twisted as I ran after her, curving in ways that didn't make sense. I turned left and found myself in a hallway lined with bookshelves that reached up into darkness. The lights were dim, golden orbs floating in the air like fireflies. The smell of cedar and paper grew stronger, mingling with something metallic, something that smelled like a storm about to break. I rounded another corner, breathless, and there she was again, standing beside a doorway I could have sworn hadn't been there a second ago. She looked at me, her gaze heavy, assessing. You followed. I couldn't think of anything to say. She tilted her umbrella back, though there was no rain here, and gestured toward the doorway. You might as well come in. I hesitated, because something in her voice, soft, lilting, as though she were speaking in a dream, told me this wasn't just a door. It was an invitation. What's in there? I managed to ask. The in-between, she replied. Her answer felt like it belonged to a question I hadn't asked yet. She stepped through the doorway without waiting for me, and the darkness seemed to fold around her. I stood there for what felt like a long time, the ticking sound from earlier growing louder, filling my ears until it was all I could hear. I don't remember deciding to step through. My feet moved on their own. The doorway opened into something vast. It wasn't a room, it was a space. A void, but not empty. Colors swirled in the distance. Blues, golds, streaks of black that twisted like ink dropped in water. Platforms floated in the dark, some small as stepping stones, others large enough to hold entire cities. I stood on the edge of the first one, looking down at nothing. The woman was ahead of me, walking as if she knew the way. Her black umbrella was gone, replaced by a staff made of pale wood that shimmered faintly, like it was carved from moonlight. What is this place? I called. She turned, her smile just as faint, just as sharp. The place between everything. Between what? Dreams, thoughts, realities. She tilted her head. You see it now because you were paying attention. I didn't know what to say to that. The platform beneath me felt solid enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground might give way at any moment, dropping me into the endless dark. Why did you bring me here? She started walking again. I didn't bring you. You followed. That's not the same thing. I stepped after her, though every instinct I had told me to turn back. But there was no door behind me anymore. Only more platforms, stretching into infinity. I followed her across bridges that appeared as we walked, thin ribbons of silver that hummed faintly beneath my feet. At some point, we reached a place where the darkness rippled and shapes began to form. Fragmented buildings, faces made of mist, staircases that led nowhere. What is this? I whispered. Forgotten things, she said. Memories people abandoned. Choices they never made. Moments they never lived. I felt something shift under my feet and looked down. A single red door was embedded in the platform beneath me, its paint chipped, its handle gleaming. I knew, somehow, that it was mine. She stopped and gestured to it with her staff. You can leave, if you want. The key is always yours. I stared at the door, my heart pounding. I didn't remember getting a key, but when I reached into my pocket, I found one there. A simple brass key, heavy and cold. What happens if I don't leave? I asked. Her gray eyes softened, just a little. Then you stay, and you learn what most people choose not to see. The door seemed to pulse, waiting. I turned the key in my hand, feeling the weight of it. Above me, the darkness shifted, and for just a moment, I saw something. My life, ordinary and small, but safe. I looked back at the woman, her figure blending into the space around her, and I felt it, like I'd stumbled onto the edge of something vast, something that had been waiting for me all along. And so I made my choice. When I turned the key, the door didn't open outward. It opened inward. The first time I saw it, I was walking home from the late shift at the diner, my shoes sticking to the pavement with the grease I hadn't managed to scrub off during cleanup. It was 1:45. The streets were empty, and the air hung thick with that strange electric quiet that comes when the world feels like it's on pause. I was 3 blocks from my apartment when I noticed the glow. At first, I thought it was a streetlight flickering, an old bulb about to burn out. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't coming from the lamppost at all. It was coming from the alley. A faint, pulsing glow, the color of old gold, spilling out onto the sidewalk in rhythmic waves. I stopped, staring at it. My brain was already running through excuses not to investigate. It's nothing. Someone's phone. A reflection. Go home. You're tired. But my feet didn't listen. They carried me forward, one hesitant step at a time, until I was standing at the mouth of the alley. It was empty, at least, it looked empty at first. Just a narrow corridor lined with graffiti-covered brick and puddles that reflected the weak light of the city. But then I saw it. The vending machine. It stood in the middle of the alley, completely out of place, as if someone had dropped it there by mistake. It wasn't like the soda or snack machines you'd see at the mall. This one was ancient, battered, its metal sides scratched and dented like it had been dragged through a war. The glow was coming from it, specifically from the slot where you'd usually insert coins. There was a handwritten sign taped to the front of it, scrawled in jagged black letters that looked like they'd been written in a hurry. 1 token per wish. My first thought was that it was some kind of art installation, maybe a weird marketing gimmick. But the longer I stood there, the more uneasy I felt. The machine hummed softly, almost like it was breathing. The glow pulsed faster, as if it could sense me. I don't know why I reached into my pocket. Maybe it was the hum, or the strange pull of that golden light. All I know is that my fingers brushed against something cold and round, a token I definitely hadn't had when I left work. It was heavy, smooth, and warm to the touch. One side was blank, the other had an engraving of a key. I turned it over in my palm, trying to make sense of it. My stomach was doing somersaults. Every instinct told me to leave, to forget the whole thing, but something deeper, something more curious, more reckless, urged me forward. I stepped closer to the machine. The moment I slid the token into the slot, the humming stopped. The glow faded, replaced by a sharp click as the machine whirred to life. The selection buttons lit up, each one marked with a word. They weren't snacks or drinks, they were wishes. Things like power, love, truth, time, revenge. I froze. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. Wishes didn't come from vending machines. But the machine sat there, patient, waiting for me to choose. My finger hovered over love for a moment before moving to truth. Then time. My pulse was hammering in my ears. Did I even want any of these? What if it worked? Before I could second-guess myself, my hand jerked forward and pressed the button marked understanding. The machine made a deep, mechanical groan, like an old engine turning over. The light from the coin slot flared one last time, blinding me for a moment. When it faded, the vending machine was gone. The alley was empty again, silent except for the distant hum of the city. I stood there, blinking, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. No sudden revelations, no magical insights. Just me, alone in the dark, feeling like an idiot. I walked home, annoyed and unsettled, tossing the memory of the machine into the mental junk drawer where I kept all the other weird, inexplicable moments in my life. But the next day, the world started to shift. It began with small things. I could hear people's words before they said them, like faint whispers on the edge of my consciousness. When my boss yelled at me for forgetting an order, I knew he wasn't really mad at me. He was worried about the rent on his second apartment. When my neighbor complimented my shoes, I could feel the jealousy hiding behind her smile, like a pebble in a shoe. By the end of the week, it wasn't just thoughts I could sense. It was everything. Every lie, every truth, every buried fear or hope. It was like the entire world had been peeled back, its skin removed to reveal the messy, tangled nerves underneath. It was unbearable. I couldn't walk down the street without being overwhelmed. The guy handing out flyers outside the subway was desperate, his stomach aching with hunger. The woman jogging past me was holding back tears because her dog had died that morning. Every person I passed was an open wound, raw and exposed, and I couldn't stop feeling them. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating. The vending machine had granted my wish, but it had turned my life into a nightmare. The next time I heard the sound, the faint, dragging hum, I knew exactly what it was. I ran toward it this time, following the glow to a different alley, a different vending machine. This one was newer, shinier, but the sign was the same, 1 token per wish. I dug through my pockets, praying for another token. When my fingers finally closed around one, I nearly cried with relief. I didn't hesitate. I slid the token into the slot and pressed the button marked forget. The machine hummed, brighter and louder than before. My vision blurred, my ears filled with static, and then silence. When I opened my eyes, I was standing at the edge of the alley, staring at nothing but empty pavement. My head felt clear for the first time in days, my heart steady. I couldn't remember why I'd come there, but it didn't matter. The air felt lighter, the world normal again. As I walked home, the vending machine faded from my mind completely, slipping away like a forgotten dream. But somewhere, in some other corner of the city, I know it's waiting. And next time, it'll find someone else.